Hi, welcome. I'm Lisa Schwartz. Welcome to Berkeley Lab's webinar on grid resilience planning. It's funded by the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Resilience Office. Today, we're focusing on severe storms and hurricanes for the eastern and southeastern states. Next slide. We'll start off with Miles Collins. He'll apply NARUC's new grid resilience framework to storms and hurricanes, and then he'll focus on data, metrics, and analyses for these threats in both the East and Southeast US. And after a short break, I'll host a panel with state reps from Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Massachusetts, all talking about what they're doing and learning in their jurisdictions. And then Miles will host a utility panel with Con Ed, Duke, and Avangrid. Next slide. So just a few housekeeping items. If you can, please add your affiliation to your Zoom name. We show you how to do that here. Please mute when you're not speaking. Use the Zoom Q&A feature to ask questions during the meeting at any time. And when we open the meeting for Q&A at different times, you can also raise your hand to get on the floor if you want to ask your question live. We are recording and we'll post the session to share with the public. And we'll put a link in the chat to the slides. Next slide. I just wanted to show a couple of resources. Coming up, we have another webinar that'll focus on the Midwest region on cold snaps and ice storms targeted for early August. We'll announce the date shortly and we'll send to everybody on this list. And we also plan to host a webinar on extreme heat, and we would just do a national focus since it's really happening just about everywhere. And we'll also announce that shortly. We have slides and recordings posted for prior trainings and webinars. And we have a link that we'll put in the chat and also in the slides on all our resilience and reliability research. And I also wanted to highlight our partners, NARUC and NASIO, for the public utility commissions and state energy offices. They have a lot of great resilience resources as well. Miles?
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be speaking with everyone today. I'm going to be giving an overview of a recent publication from the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC. So I'm not an author of the study, but I am a consumer, and I'm going to be approaching this overview through the lens of applying the framework to severe storm and hurricane mitigation planning. So in 2023, NARUC initiated a project to help state utility regulators identify and address resilience efforts in their jurisdictions. So with funding from the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office, NARUC sought to better understand the needs of its members to respond to proposals to plan for and enhance resilience within their jurisdictions. So with facilitation help from E9 Insight, NARUC held meetings across the U.S. with state regulators to hear about their needs and challenges. Based on this information, NARUC established 3 peer learning cohorts focused on specific topics. So one was resilience metrics, second was resilience valuation methodologies, and then a third was regulatory mechanisms. And these 3 cohorts were part of the larger Department of Energy cohort series called Energy Security and Grid Resilience Cohorts, which was sponsored by DOE's Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, or CSER, and Grid Deployment Office in collaboration with NASIO and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. The need for a resilience framework emerged through the work of these cohorts. So it's not a how-to guide for developing specific actionable grid resilience plans, but instead it helps gather information that could be valuable for decision makers to use to generate positive outcomes that meet stakeholders' needs. To be useful, it was clear that a resilience framework needed to be adaptable to a wider range of regulatory contexts and regional threats, and flexible to meet a variety of resilience applications. So NARUC's resulting grid resilience framework serves several purposes. So it guides regulators. It's designed to help state agencies and PUCs identify questions they can ask when considering resilience investments and planning processes. It aids other decision makers. So beyond regulators, the framework considers other state agencies and stakeholders involved in or affected by grid resilience and identifies ways they can participate in resilience-related discussions and decision making. And then finally, it supports grid and resilience planning. So the framework aligns with NARUC's broader goal of providing resources that promote thoughtful decision making in emerging areas of policy and technology. So this slide shows the 6 components of the framework. The presentation runs through each of these components. So we'll start with goals and objectives in the upper left, and then we'll move clockwise and cover the use cases, definitions, process leadership and participation, design questions, and then finally implementation. So the framework can be used in any order or combination. The report notes that as regulators and state energy offices gather more experience in reviewing resilience proposals and conducting planning and collecting information, they may choose to use the framework in a more linear fashion. So the cohort participants that I mentioned noted that state regulators and energy offices may have been reviewing resilience proposals in a vacuum. So it's either due to time constraints or lacking appropriate context for the proposals. They recognize that having a set of goals and objectives is an important piece of their process that may have been lacking or not adequately expressed prior to making decisions. So as a result, success was more difficult to recognize, and measurements of progress were difficult to contextualize because there were few to no points of reference for progress, success, or failure. So to help decision makers address grid resilience, it's helpful to clarify and agree on the ultimate vision for a resilient grid in the state, which this framework characterizes as the resilience goal, as well as the milestones on the journey to that future, which in this framework are considered the objectives. So examples apply to severe storms. For objectives, you'd be looking at, for example, asset conditions. So what's the percentage of distribution poles inspected within, let's say, 8 years? Infrastructure hardening. So what's the percentage of distribution lines that have been undergrounded? On technology deployment, you could be looking at the percentage of customers with access to a microgrid. Operational criteria, what are average restoration times for down lines? And then for emissions at the bottom there, we would have the percentage of energy used as backup power that is low or zero emissions. These are all measurable targets and activities that can help achieve the broader resilience goals. Cohort participants also noted that the inclusion of use cases and example scenarios in this framework can help apply these concepts to their jurisdictions and specific circumstances. So by considering these scenarios, they can apply the framework to a specific context and outline potential needs and pathways to reach relevant goals or decisions. So for example, developing plans or programs or making decisions on investments. So examples of use cases for severe storms would be policy implementation. So developing the regulations to implement legislation that could be passed on storm planning, perhaps after a severe storm hits the state. Long-term planning. So what are the resilience valuation methodologies and how will they be used to make longer-term planning decisions? And then you could have grants for community solutions. You could have utility investments. So for storm planning, you'd be looking at vegetation management, let's say, or targeted undergrounding. And then you could also have programs focused on customer-oriented solutions like storage incentive programs. The process of developing resilience programs or conducting planning for resilience benefits greatly from establishing a set of shared definitions for resilience terminology early in the process. So the electric system's changing, the way we use it's changing, and the need to educate new stakeholder groups and communities highlights the importance and value of a common set of terms and definitions. And the framework document provides some definitions as starting points for discussion. For example, one potential definition for resilience is in the blue box on this slide and can be used or adapted as needed. So the ability to prepare for threats and hazards, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. Other examples of definitional areas, we would have resilient solution categories. So you could have solutions for preparation, mitigation, response, and recovery. On event severity level, this is distinguishing between different event severities or conditions, which can be useful when evaluating resilience of a system. So related to severe storms, you can have your hurricanes, category 1 through 5, versus tropical storm versus tropical depression, which have their own set of criteria for when you move from one to the other. Priority zones. So some state resilience planning efforts and programs can designate specific geographies or zones as higher priority for improved resilience. And some of these can include those with more critical infrastructure, vulnerable populations, or higher risk flood zones. And finally, resilience service level. So in measuring and valuing solutions, it can be useful to define how much resilience is being provided. And the concept of a service level is a combination of parameters into a metric or a number that can be used in a contract or rate case or program requirement. A key feature of regulatory development is the nature of the process itself. So roles and responsibilities. It's increasingly important to understand the roles and responsibilities of entities that should be involved. When a resilience event and/or an outage occurs, multiple state and local authorities play a role in providing services for the community, and state policies may identify a specific agency as the lead agency on certain topics. The importance of process leadership and participation is also applicable within a PUC. So identifying which division should lead a proceeding and which staff members should be consulted can ensure that the process being implemented by the commission includes the right internal voices that have roles to play in the resilience discussion. So this could be those that could be either leading or participating in the discussion could be the utility commission, emergency management agency, state energy office, military entities, etc. The process itself may warrant consideration. So commissions conduct different types of proceedings. A commission could decide to address resilience in a focused open proceeding or a technical session. They could address it in a separate proceeding or look at it in a broader proceeding. So for example, distribution system planning as a whole. So policy and program development can be organized as a set of design questions that leaders and stakeholders work to answer. So articulating these questions can help guide the process and generate outcomes that support the agreed upon goals and objectives from earlier. And this will also help define the scope for any process or proceeding and guide the development of an appropriate record if that's necessary. So examples of design questions for severe storms and hurricanes. How will the state determine locations for resilience hubs where members of the community can go during a storm to receive services that might be out in other neighborhoods? How will the state define geographies that have a higher priority for improved storm resilience? And then finally, how will resilience policies and programs look at different customer classes and facility types and distinguish between them and perhaps prioritize between them for resilient solutions? And finally, implementation. So this component addresses the decisions and guidance that a decision maker may consider when carrying out resilience-related regulatory changes and programs. So it can include timelines for meeting goals and objectives, using alternative options for reviewing and determining cost effectiveness, or scheduling future reviews of resilience investments. So regardless of how implementation proceeds, there should be a clear pathway for ongoing review of investments, metrics, and programs to ensure that relevant goals and objectives are being met. As I mentioned earlier, that this framework is designed so that users apply the components in any order. But that being said, proceeding to implement resilient solutions will generally come after, or at least after some of the actions described in the preceding slides have occurred. So implementation questions include some of the ones here on the slide here. So what decisions are needed to implement storm mitigation measures? Who are the decision makers? What data needs need to be considered, and who will collect the data? The actions and processes, which ones are required by state agencies? What legislative action is required? And then how do they relate to other existing programs and procedures? So this is my last slide for this presentation. To summarize, the resilience framework is intended for use by regulators and other stakeholders to help identify resilience outcomes and develop strategies, goals, and objectives for achieving them. It's not intended as a prescriptive how-to guide, but rather as one tool among many within the broader landscape of resilience resources. It provides structure, flexibility, and adaptability to support current and future efforts. So I'll just leave you with this summary of considerations to keep in mind when applying the framework. So first, what's the environment in which you're operating? The framework's adaptable, and so it's important to look at that and determining how to adapt it. What are the needs of the state, agency, utilities, and customers? And then finally, why is resilience being addressed, and what do you want to get out of the framework? So I'll note that the report includes applications and further considerations from each cohort. So this concludes presentation on the NARUC resilience framework. My contact information here, as is Lisa Schwartz's. I will be moving to the next presentation here before we do Q&A. So I'm going to flip forward here. And my next presentation is on bridging the gap on data, metrics, and analyses for grid resilience to weather events. So after this presentation, we'll open it for Q&A. In this segment, I'll be discussing a recent Berkeley Lab report that we published in January on data, metrics, and analyses related to grid resilience. And so for this reason, I'll be focusing on portions or for this session, I'll be focusing on portions of the report relevant to planning for severe storms and hurricanes. And the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office provided funding for this study. The aim of the study was to help bridge the gap between the data, metrics, and analyses that utilities use and the information that they provide to regulators, state energy offices, and other stakeholders that engage in grid resilience planning. And in so doing, it can help state regulators identify, describe, request, and use utility data and analyses to inform their decisions on utility resilience plans and cost recovery requests for investments. And it can also help stakeholders understand why certain information is needed and what information the utility can provide. So in the report and throughout this presentation, we use the definition of resilience in the light blue box, which reads, the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. Okay, so looking at methodology and framework for the study, our research team reviewed resilience planning requirements for 15 states and 1 city. These requirements direct utilities to develop plans to address certain hazards. So we reviewed the utility resilience plans themselves, 4 dozen of them, to assess the resilience data, metrics, and analyses that utilities provided to regulators and stakeholders. The plans had a variety of names, in some cases reflecting the specific types of hazards they address, such as storm prevention plans in Florida and wildfire mitigation plans in Western states. Other plans covered multiple extreme weather threats. And some resilience plans are incorporated into broader planning filings like distribution system plans. We reviewed the relevant academic literature and reports from industry working groups. And then finally, we conducted 9 interviews with staff at public utility commissions and state energy offices and subject matter experts at utilities to identify common challenges and emerging best practices. The literature contains a number of resilience planning frameworks that utilities can leverage in their planning processes. The frameworks vary in content and nomenclature, but they generally include an assessment of hazard risk or vulnerability, and also an evaluation of potential mitigation measures, including a prioritization process or selection method for the measures based on the results of the vulnerability or risk assessment and the expected cost and effectiveness of mitigation measures. The figure here shows the overarching categories used in this study. It's not prescriptive, but instead is used to organize the data metrics and analyses in the utility resilience plans. So the vulnerability category at the top of the figure is a stakeholder-informed process that identifies communities, infrastructure, facilities, and processes that are vulnerable to specific hazards and prioritizes these risks or vulnerabilities that are most important to mitigate based on the likelihood of occurrence and potential impacts. Hazard exposure on the left comprises data on weather hazards and the exposure of a utility's assets or operations, and ultimately its customers to these hazards. Attribute metrics describe system characteristics that contribute to the resilience of the system and community. So, for example, they can describe the extent to which assets have been hardened or mitigation measures have been implemented, and thus whether the electric system and its customers are sensitive to damage from a particular hazard. Performance metrics characterize the impacts of mitigation measures on system performance, often through a reduction in the negative consequences of hazard events. The vulnerability assessment category in the diagram spans across the three categories below it as the information in these categories aligns with and can inform the different steps of the assessments. The last category on the right, evaluation and prioritization analyses, cover methodologies that utilities employ to assess and prioritize measures for implementation. So moving on to state requirements. This slide shows the 15 states with requirements for filing resilience plans. So these include California, Texas, Florida, and New York, which are the four most populous states. And thus the requirements apply to over 47 million utility customers or 135 million people, which is roughly 40% of the population. You can see the green states colored green are those where the state requirements have been identified and we reviewed the plans which were filed. Blue indicates where they were identified, but no utility plans filed yet, and then purple where the state plans are underway. So severe weather events are common catalysts for legislative or regulatory action on resilience planning requirements. Florida, for instance, passed SB 796 in 2019, which required public utilities to file storm protection plans in response to increasingly intense hurricane seasons and recent destructive storms, such as Hurricane Irma, which was in 2017, and then Hurricane Michael in 2018. States may require that resilience plans address a range of hazards, or they may focus on specific extreme weather events such as storms and wildfires. And in addition to mandating specific plans to address certain hazards, some state requirements provided guidance on the data, metrics, and analyses to be included either within the plans themselves or in separate filings. And this slide gives an overview of and some more detail on those requirements. So we reviewed the requirements to determine what data metrics and analyses must be filed, either as part of the resilience plan or in supplemental reports. And this slide shows an overview of that. So they're divided into three groups. Those addressing multiple hazards are in the group on the top, and these include general all hazard resilience as part of requirements for climate vulnerability assessments, distribution system plans, and infrastructure modernization, among others. The middle group is for severe storms, and then the lower group is specifically for wildfires. The different circles indicate the level of specificity for each set of requirements as it relates to each of the columns in the table. So darker orange indicates that the element is required and that the language is specific about what's required. Lighter orange is required but higher level. And then light blue indicates that states recommend providing certain types of information in addition to the information requirements. The state requirements, you can see for severe storm plans, don't have any major distinctions from the other requirements, either for the range of hazards or for wildfire mitigation planning. And moving on to the data metrics and analyses in the resilience plans, vulnerability assessments starting at the top. We'll go through each of these categories one by one. But the vulnerability assessments, they typically aim to evaluate the susceptibility of systems, communities, assets, and processes to potential harm from identified hazards. They can focus on understanding key factors such as exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and potential consequences. So if we're looking at assets, the assessments would generally include an analysis and characterization of the hazard. Looking at either historical data or future data on the future projections on the hazard. Exposure, so the degree to which utility assets could face a given hazard based on location and environmental factors. Sensitivity, so the degree to which an asset could be affected by exposure to climate hazards. So for example, the sensitivity of undergrounded versus overhead lines to wind. In multi-hazard climate vulnerability assessment, some utility plans may use a high, medium, and low ranking system for exposure and sensitivity. And finally, there's potential consequences of the event. So what's the estimated magnitude of the negative outcomes? So these assessments also look more broadly to take community sensitivity and adaptive capacity into account. Adaptive capacity refers to the ability of systems, institutions, and people to adjust to potential damage, to take advantage of opportunities, or to respond to consequences. So, for example, access to transportation to get from somewhere without power to somewhere with power. The greater the adaptive capacity, the less the vulnerability. So I mentioned the vulnerability assessments and the utility resilience plans we reviewed combined quantitative and qualitative assessments to identify high, medium, and low vulnerabilities to extreme weather hazards for specific utility assets or processes. So the exposure assessment was typically quantitative, involving granular GIS analysis of utility asset locations, combined with large data sets of downscaled climate projections. After identifying the asset hazard combinations that were exposed, the sensitivity and consequences assessments involved more qualitative assessments with subject matter expert input to supplement that quantitative exposure assessment. This shows an example of Rochester Gas and Electric and NYSEG from their vulnerability assessment. You can see on the left, they have the rating rubric, which matches up sensitivity and consequence with definitions for low, medium, and high for each, and then when vulnerability would be considered low, medium, and high based on the combination of each of those. And then on the right, the result of the assessment from looking at the assets, which are in the different rows, versus the different hazards, which are in the different columns, and determining which assets have vulnerability to which specific hazards. So moving to hazard exposure, this category covers data related to the hazards and to the level and nature of the exposure to that hazard. So we see the types of data in the plans that generally fall into the 4 subcategories here. So the hazard data variables, this could be like floodplain extent and depth, sea level rise, storm surge potential, or wind speeds. Future hazard scenarios, so these are the downscaled global climate models to what temperature, precipitation, and other weather patterns may be in the future. The time frame, so generally for looking at severe storms, it could be as few as 5 years, but looking 10 years out is a more common time frame in the plans. And then data sources. So where are utilities getting the data to perform the analyses? And this is all information that utilities use and can share with stakeholders during the planning process. This slide shows two examples of examining the exposure to hazards from National Grid's vulnerability study. So on the left, the hazard is wind, and the color shows 1 in 100 year wind gust speed. The figure reflects the exposure of subtransmission structures. And on the right, the hazard is flood risk. The assets are substations, and then the colors show the flood risk level for each substation. Moving to the next category of attribute metrics. So these are characteristics that contribute to or describe the resilience of the system and community. They align with the specific definition of resilience. So for this report, they would describe the ability of the system or community to anticipate a hazard, withstand the hazard, adapt to the hazard impacts, and recover from the hazard to a normal operating state. These components are generally referred to as the phases of resilience. Utilities that can carefully track attribute metrics can connect the asset characteristics with specific performance metrics. This table shows the types of attribute metrics described in the utility resilience plans for each of the 4 resilience phases. So it's worth noting that we saw in the literature and resilience plans a number of different definitions of resilience and different names for the phases of resilience. Although in general, the concepts are similar and states and utilities can determine and use what makes sense for them. So going through each of these briefly, anticipate metrics, we saw these describe the likelihood or characteristics of potential impacts caused by a hazard. And they can also describe the ability of the system to track and identify hazards, such as through more robust weather forecasting and monitoring systems. The withstand metrics describe the electrical system's capacity to avoid being affected by a hazard, and these include asset condition, ratings, or hardening status. On the adapt side, this looks at the ability of the grid to respond to asset damage or of the community to change behavior to minimize impacts to customers. Some reports refer to this as the absorb phase, but these metrics can reflect the system redundancy, so where backup systems or resources are in place to ensure that critical functions continue during a disruption. And then recover metrics describe the ability of the utility to return to normal operation after hazard events. So moving along to performance metrics. So these metrics describe the effectiveness of resilience investments by quantifying the extent to which they have or have not reduced the negative impacts of hazard events. So utility resilience measures seek to avoid some or all of the negative impacts of hazard events. So utility resilience measures they seek to they avoid impacts that would have occurred without the measures. So performance measures measure that progress towards achieving these resilience objectives. So we have 5 different categories of performance metrics here. We have electrical service metrics, which describe power interruptions in various ways and using a number of different variables. Asset damage and failure, which covers the impacts to assets. Response and restoration metrics describe the speed and effectiveness of utility restoration efforts. Monetary impacts look at the cost of impacts to the utility, to customers, and to the regional economy. And then customer communications and engagement metrics would describe how effective utility outreach efforts are. And these are important as utilities communicate about impending storms, interruptions, and expected restoration times. Regulators, utilities, and stakeholders can examine performance metrics across additional dimensions, which this slide reflects. And they can do this by looking at critical and essential infrastructure as well as vulnerable populations within the service territory. So we see this throughout the plans. One type of infrastructure that they look specifically at is critical facilities. And These are essential for the health and well-being of the community and include things like hospitals, fire stations, water treatment facilities. Um, Also on the slide is a second category here of essential facilities, which would be those that the state deems as not as critical as the first category, but are nonetheless important for remaining open during a resilience event. So this can include gas stations, grocery stores, pharmacies. And then vulnerable populations. So this is taking a look specifically at those populations that may have a harder time dealing with the resilience events or the associated interruptions. So this could include elderly, people with life support systems, disabilities, and other medical needs that could impact their ability to move from one location to another or to deal with the event. So this table shows examples of metrics for electrical service. So many of them are actually your typical reliability metrics that utilities have adapted for resilience planning, either by including MEDs or looking specifically at MEDs. MEDs being major event days, which are statistically determined days when utility system performance is significantly impacted by events outside of normal operating conditions, such as extreme weather. Utilities are also using the indices uh, only for times when perhaps there were certain environmental conditions, such as high wind warnings or severe storms, which some states have as a separate classification for major event days. So there's a few key dimensions of granularity for interruption data that can help in targeting electrical service metrics. The IEEE standard listed on this slide on the right provides guidance for collecting, categorizing, and using interruption information. So the structured approach that that standard lays out helps to determine and categorize what the cause of the interruption is and can enable a consistent reporting and more detailed analysis. So for example, to measure the effectiveness of a certain resilience measure, you can isolate the analysis to interruptions within a certain period on certain circuits that had a particular cause. This slide shows the next two categories of electrical service metrics. So on the left here, we have asset damage or failure. In this category covers metrics that utilities use to track the extent and characteristics of asset damage from severe weather events. It also covers the performance of assets during these events and then also the rates of repair and replacement. For the purposes of this report, the category includes only the asset information and not the monetary impacts. On the right is we have the response and recovery category. So on the response side, this could be the level of resource engagement, the extent of mobilization efforts, such as crew deployments, and different levels of efficiency. On restoration, these metrics tend to focus on the time to restore a certain portion of customers to power or on the portion of customers restored given a certain amount of time. So it examines that relationship between percent of customers restored and time. And you see here, there's certain ones that more utilities use and others that utilities are experimenting with. So if we start with the time metrics, this could be from the beginning of the interruption to a point when X% of the customers have been restored, or there's one that National Grid was experimenting with, which is from peak outage, the point of peak outages to 95% restoration. And then on the flip side, looking at the percent of customers restored within a certain number of hours of the major storm. So this takes a look at monetary impact metrics, and we'll go through an example here too. So three categories. We have utility costs, which could be capital or operations and maintenance, or O&M. So it covers the monetary impacts of damage from resilience events, as well as O&M costs from restoration activities. Second category there is the customer interruption costs. So these are those incurred by customers experiencing a power interruption. So Berkeley Lab has a tool called the ICE calculator, which is used by a number of utilities across the US, which aggregates customer interruption cost studies that have been conducted across the country and provides estimates of costs for interruptions shorter than 24 hours. So the customer interruption cost studies are conducted by surveying residential, commercial, and industrial customers to determine the costs that they incur. And then finally, for widespread long duration interruptions lasting more than 24 hours, we start seeing spillover effects. So where, for example, an interruption to a manufacturing facility could impact all the customers of that facility who wouldn't be receiving the goods it would produce. So for these types of interruptions, we can use macroeconomic models. The one example of this type of model is a prototype that Berkeley Lab has developed and piloted with its partners called the prototype or called the Power Outage Economics Tool, or POET. One of its partners was Commonwealth Edison in Illinois. It uses a hybrid valuation approach with those customer interruption cost surveys to collect information on household and business customer behavior, and then uses that data to calibrate the macroeconomic model of the regional economy. So the bar chart on the right shows changes to gross domestic product from interruptions lasting 1 day, which is in green, 3 days, which is in yellow, and then 14 days, which is in red. So this last category in our framework covers evaluation and prioritization analyses. The category includes ex post analyses, which compare performance of the electric grid before and after implementing resilience measures. In an ideal ex post analysis, researchers would be able to control for various factors like weather that could impact system performance in order to isolate the impact of the mitigation measure. This can prove to be challenging for severe weather events, but we see more and more utilities that are aiming to do it. Ex-ante analyses are forward-looking and estimate what the impacts would be from implementing mitigation measures. So they often leverage information learned in ex-post analyses to predict future performance. And then prioritization analyses. So these would include various methods for determining which measures to implement and how to prioritize them within the budget constraint. So there's a few different methods for prioritizing these. You can look at benefit cost analysis, multi-criteria assessment, and then risk or value spend efficiency. So the example here on the bottom right is one that was in a resilience plan, and this is Florida Power and Light, which analyzed the impact of its distribution and transmission inspection programs by comparing performance of distribution poles and transmission facilities during Hurricane Wilma, which was before the program, to performance for Hurricane Irma, which was after implementation. So what this reflects is that they saw more customer outages, but fewer distribution poles needing replacement and faster restoration times. Then finally, looking at some key findings from the study and emerging best practices. So this slide, well, first of all, planning is difficult is one key finding and presents a number of challenges. So severe weather events are infrequent and they're hard to predict. Effects are experienced unevenly across the territory, and then measures are expensive, but may never be put to the test by an event. So those aspects make planning tricky. It presents challenges for utilities, regulators, and stakeholders, but they're taking steps to address them. So in particular, they're looking outside of traditional reliability metrics to try and capture complexity of resilient systems. And they're also defining and considering vulnerable populations and taking steps to measure and track performance of resilience measures. What we see, or what we saw in the study, so although resilience planning is relatively nascent, we see a number of emerging best practices from our research. So first is to select or establish a clear analysis framework. So it's important for regulators and utilities to have mutual understanding of the resilience planning framework, which guides the development and sharing of data, metrics, and analyses to support the planning process. Consistent definitions and accurate location data for critical facilities. So I won't go into detail on that one, but it's essential for the planning process. Vulnerable populations, so developing a more thorough understanding of these populations and their capacity to adapt to power interruptions of varying durations. This enables more effective strategies for reducing negative impacts, such as I discussed earlier, where you locate resilience hubs. Measuring impacts consistently and at a granular level. So I discussed this one already, but outage management system data contains a wealth of information about causes and locations of interruptions, as well as affected equipment, and could be very useful for as a planning resource, particularly if it's standardized and consistent. Addressing uncertainty. So there's a lot of uncertainty in planning for low frequency, high impact weather events, and novel ways to address it and communicate it can help the planning process. Using combinations of metrics, so knowing the expected trade-offs between metrics. Improving resilience may involve a trade-off between these metrics. And then finally, with ex post analyses, which I discussed, so I mentioned that these are improving. They had tended to be more ad hoc and limiting the comparability of results across regions and years, but an emerging opportunity is to conduct ex post analyses more systematically and on a regular basis, including with the use of statistically representative comparison groups. And with that, I will open it up. We have a couple minutes here if anyone would like to pose any questions and before we move on.
Hey, Miles, we have one question so far, asking whether you reviewed any of the risk assessments in state energy security plans, or I'll amend the question, did any of the utility filed plans with commissions mention anything about the state energy security plans?
We didn't review the state energy security plans specifically as ones that would be included within the number of documents that I mentioned. We did review them and look for the information that like that, you know, that whether it's metrics or the types of issues that states and utilities or that states are grappling with. So when we spoke to, I mentioned we spoke to a number of subject matter experts within the states and at the utilities. So that helped to color our, you know, the questions that we asked them for those particular data collection exercises and making sure that we understood the challenges that they were facing and the different solutions they were looking for, but they weren't included as a specific resilience plan as we defined it here.
Okay, we got a question through the chat box, which is a bit of a push-pull in my view. Despite the anticipated benefits of advanced technologies and strategies, with respect to improved performance for more resilient grids, why do these benefits not get realized in reality? So I think that's an assumption built in, but how would you address that in evaluation in an objective way?
Well, I think, you know, and I mentioned the opportunity for the ex post analyses, but you know, being able to compare when you implement a resilience measure, being able to compare the infrastructure that receives the investment with one that does not, and able to get as close to apples as you can to actually determine what the benefit is. So you're essentially looking for a closed control group. I would say on the one hand, though, I mentioned this in the challenges in our key findings slide that you can identify a vulnerability that might have has a higher risk and high consequences of negative outcomes and make an investment and then just due to natural weather patterns you might never actually realize that investment, or you might not see that weather for years to come. So it is, dealing with that level of uncertainty. It's one thing that makes the planning process difficult, and it's an issue that states certainly have to grapple with. But to the extent that you can think of your how you're going to be measuring progress as you're setting up the investment plan, when those events do occur, you can certainly make it more quantifiable in your measurement.
Great, thanks, Miles. We don't have any more questions. We are just in time for our break. So we're going to break until 5 minutes before the hour. That is 2:55 on the East Coast and 11:55 here in Pacific time. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. Hi, welcome back. We have 4 state panelists to talk about grid resilience planning for severe storms and hurricanes. First up, Ben Bolton is the Senior Energy Programs Administrator at Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. And then we'll have Alex Butler, Resilience Director at the South Carolina Office of Resilience. Amanda Lemaster is the Energy Assurance and Efficiency Coordinator in the Office of Energy Policy, which is part of Kentucky's Energy and Environment Cabinet. And finally, Brian Ritziger is Director of Clean Energy and Grid Resilience Engineering at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. So it's a great panel. And after all 4 presentations are completed, I'll moderate a panel discussion. So you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. Again, enter your questions at any time in the Q&A box. If you want to ask your question live, just use the raise your hand function under the React menu, and we'll get to you during the Q&A session. So first up, Ben.
All right, thank you, Lisa, and thank you for organizing this event and inviting me to speak to everyone today about grid resilience planning and some of the efforts that we do here in Tennessee. It's a little all over the place. First off, I like to say that Tennessee is a little bit different because we have the land of TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. So utility planning, when 99.7% of your electricity is generated by a single corporation, but it's federally owned, that makes for a unique landscape when it comes to planning. But I do think there's a lot of things that we are doing that are applicable to this topic, as well as some things that we think are have a nice crossover, not just with utility planning, but also energy security. So in addition to being the Senior Energy Programs Administrator, I appreciate Lisa going through all our long government titles, but I also want to add in there that I'm also co-chair of NASIO's Energy Security Committee. So that becomes a great role in helping coordinate a lot of these efforts on a regular basis, not just during emergencies, but it's not just emergency response that we get involved with, but it's the planning and preparedness that helps us respond better. And as I like to say, as we make things more resilient or we mitigate against these disasters, then that's less I have to do during a response. So part of what Tennessee is doing with our 401(d) funds is we're developing a mapping tool. And thanks to DOE, we have an energy fellow, Ryan Shin, that's been working on this mapping tool. I had hoped that it would be live by this point, but as you can imagine, with a lot of uncertainty that has come around several different things, it's not quite ready for prime time, but it's very close. So what we've done, and it's mainly primarily his work, has been developing a mapping tool that we intend to not just have for grant applicants to use, but the public in general, and it will help with also mitigation grants. But we wanted to collect some of the federal data sets that are out there, look at it together. How can we better, because we know utilities have a hard time finding some of these historical data sets, some of the utility boundaries, for instance, are really difficult to get to. So we've been working with Oak Ridge National Lab on a lot of this effort as well. When you've got a national lab in your backyard, you should use it. And even if you don't, you should still use them if you can. So part of what with that mapping tool is we're going to tell you the end goal, and that is we're going to require applicants for these grant programs to upload an export of the results they get from using the tool as part of their application process. So we know that they have to do this analysis to show that they're making the right investment, to show that their projects are going to go in the right places. So we thought, how could we make that easier for the applicants themselves, but then at the same time make sure that we're providing that screening level that helps us better direct and prioritize investment when it comes to grid resilience. So this mapping tool, as far as the layers, we've pulled some in from DOE's Eagle Eye. We've pulled some in from EIA, but here are the 5 layers that we have at the moment that it's going to entail. First, it has FEMA's National Risk Index, which measures vulnerability to natural hazards all the way down to the census tract level. This is a really great layer to use. It takes an all hazards approach. You can filter it by a specific hazard. If you wanted to just look at wildfire risk, or if you wanted to look at flooding risk, which pretty much everybody has in the country at some point. So that we thought was a good foundational index to use and base that map on. But then we also looked at the Appalachian Region Commission's distressed or at-risk counties. So that's, yes, it's unique to the Appalachian region, but it also incorporates a much larger pool than you would think as far as the counties it looks at. So that looks at the economic conditions of specific counties. In Tennessee, we have 95 counties, so that's a lot of counties to go through and sift through and to assist with. And so that also will help us figure out which counties are the most economically vulnerable and should be considered as well. Another one to get towards that more sensitive populations, sometimes formerly I think we called them vulnerable populations, but also it's a focus of disaster planning across the state after some after action reports from the many disasters we've responded to just in the last few years, has been focusing on functional and access needs with people and trying to figure out those populations that are more at risk in general. So from an electricity standpoint, that becomes then what people have critical medical devices down at the county level that are dependent on electricity to live. And so those there is a layer that has the number of Medicare beneficiaries who are dependent on critical medical devices. So you put that in there, and that helps you determine, okay, well, do you have a large population in this part of the census tract or the county, another area? And then we're taking, then we're also using the FEMA Critical Disaster Resilience Zone. Those are fairly new designation, but it's areas that FEMA has gone through and done a little bit of the same kind of analysis and determined these particular census tracts are more vulnerable to disasters in general. And so that's another good way to consider resilience investment in those particular zones. And then finally, we took the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, and we put another layer of analysis on it and altered it a little bit. And we're calling it right now the OEP, the Office of Energy Programs Opportunity Index. And so we're flagging census tracts that are in the 90th percentile for one of following housing criteria, basically: elderly residents, housing density, household income, unemployed residents, residents without high school degrees, what's the housing cost burden, uninsured residents, residents without vehicles, which is a huge vulnerability in most areas of the country, and single parents. And so all of those combined, if any one of those are above the 90th percentile for those, then that will also be another flag on that layer. So that's basically the 5 layers we're focused on at the moment. There's some others we're looking at, and we'll be pairing it with outage metrics that are going to be provided by Oak Ridge National Lab. Risk assessments. So I saw there was a question.
We're going to hold questions till the end, I think.
Okay. So then that's kind of the grid resilience planning tool as far as what we're going to do on that level. But we're taking another step too. That's only one layer of it. The other one is we're doing what we call critical to TN, and it's a survey effort where we're IDing critical facilities in each county. The county's involved in the effort. The county determines what they think is critical to their county functioning. And each of those, state Homeland is involved with that, our state Homeland Security agent, the emergency management agencies, and our office at the state level. And part of those questions is asking, do they have a backup generator? Do they have hookups or pigtails? And then asking the simple question of, if you don't have either, are you interested in it? So simply asking that question of, are you interested, automatically starts surveying the entire state and critical facilities and start asking that question of, okay, well, how can we make things more resilient? If they're interested, that's a good startup. As far as utility planning itself goes, we've been involved with our Advanced Nuclear Working Group. We're a very advanced state when it comes to nuclear power, and part of that's because we've had it for a long time. We have TVA, we have Oak Ridge, and of course the Y-12 National Security Complex. So we're very positioned to explore nuclear, and we have the first construction permit submitted for a small modular nuclear reactor, or SMR. So that's something that we're working very hard on. And then our office has been directly related in TVA's integrated resource planning. So they just finished, I was part of that stakeholder working group. TVA did something a little different with this one than before. They had a group of about 30 of us and our alternates that were involved in the entire planning process from the beginning, and actually even before. I was part of something that they called Utility of the Future, where they went through and did more conceptual, high level, what matters to all these stakeholder groups that we represent, and what are things that TVA as a whole should, and the board should start considering. So that was, I thought, was a very innovative thing planning wise that they did, that was much more high level, and resilience was something that kept coming up. And then in the integrated resource planning, we were literally involved with helping develop the scenarios. So from a stakeholder standpoint, instead of them developing the plan in a silo, we were involved all along the way with each step of the process, which I thought was a very beneficial thing. So by the time a draft was released, frankly, we didn't, as an agency, we didn't have a ton of comments. And that was because we'd been involved in the process the entire time. We still had some, groups still had some, and there are always groups that were happy and not happy with what was produced. But by involving that, integrating the stakeholders into that process all along the way, I had that energy security voice, that resilience voice right there from the beginning and all the way to the end. So I thought that was a really great way to integrate resilience planning and just make it part of the sausage making, frankly. The last thing was we wanted to touch a little bit on coordination with other agencies. I've kind of mentioned it throughout. I'm actually embedded at the Emergency Management Agency as a state energy official. So that's a real unique role to play. So when it comes to coordination, the office next door is the DOT, then the National Guard, then the Highway Patrol, then the Health Department, and we're all sitting right in the Emergency Management Agency. So we work very, very closely when it comes to not just response, but also mitigation planning, resilience planning, and state Homeland Security is also a big part of that. So very fortunate here to be sort of enmeshed in all that kind of planning efforts. And when it comes to utilities down to the local level, that's a little more independent because of TVA and the way they work. That's why I haven't really touched on that specific. I'll leave that to the other colleagues on the panel to touch on those directly. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben. All right. Next up is Alex Butler with South Carolina Office of Resilience.
Hey, good afternoon. Yeah, I'm Alex Butler. I'm the Resilience Director here at the South Carolina Office of Resilience. Our office, our mission is to really lessen the impact of disasters on communities and citizens of the state. And we do that through our resilience planning, long-term recovery operations, and our hazard mitigation program. We got started after the devastating floods of 2015 that impacted South Carolina. We started up as the Disaster Recovery Office, really focused exclusively on housing stock repair for low to moderate income folks. Just as that program was getting going, we were hit again in 2016 and 2018 with additional flooding, different hurricanes, and that really led to our government master, forming a commission to look at how we could be more proactive in developing a resilience strategy for the state. And one of the recommendations out of that group was that there needed to be a state office, and that's how our office came to be in 2021. So we didn't start operations until 2021. We're still relatively new. One of the first things we had to do was develop a statewide resilience plan. And we released that in 2023. So it's about an 18-month effort, included stakeholders from many different sectors, including utility sectors, really looking at what the state's risks are long term. We did find that we needed to define resilience. I appreciated Miles' conversation about definitions and words around resilience, because it can mean different things to different folks. And for us in South Carolina, we define resilience as the ability of communities, economies, and ecosystems to anticipate, absorb, recover, and thrive when presented with environmental change and natural hazards. So that's how we kind of frame resilience when we're looking at it. Our state plan that was released was really, developed using some key principles. The first is that we needed to have high quality data to understand our vulnerability and to make that data accessible to folks to make decisions. We recognize the need to coordinate at all levels of government and both public and private sectors. Recognizing the beneficial functions of natural systems is a key part of our plan. Thinking about things on watershed boundaries, not jurisdictional or even service area boundaries, but a main portion of our plan was focused on flooding, really focused on how watersheds function. And then trying to identify the co-benefits to all the activities that kind of revolve around resilience and trying to figure out how to maximize those co-benefits. So we really started off thinking about our planning conditions. We thought a lot about soils, actually, because we're, again, primarily focused on flooding at this point. Thinking about soils, how those interact with population centers and population growth. South Carolina is the fastest growing state in the country by a percentage. So we have rapidly expanding urban areas, and thinking about how that impacts resilience long term. And then also thinking about how that interacts with our future climate conditions, thinking about how changes in rainfall intensity are going to impact our floodplains, sea level rise along the coast, and seeing how that'll impact our systems, and really trying to bring all those factors together to understand what our risk will be into the future. We supplemented kind of federal data sets and other publicly available data sets with some private data sets. We acquired the data sets from First Street Foundation, looking at all hazards that they produce. And we use that to supplement the state level data because we didn't have good state level mapping. And that's really been a benefit to us. It gives us a clearer picture of what our risks are, both from kind of a housing stock, but everywhere up to utility, substations, those sorts of things. And so we've used that data set extensively and been very happy with it. We also then kind of scoured the state for every data set that was available. And much like Ben in Tennessee there, we have created a tool to try to put that all in one location to make it easier to access. And I'll drop that in the chat here in a minute, but we've tried to put all this data in kind of one-stop shop so it can all be looked at the same time, so it's not siloed out in individual agencies. And then we also use different indices to look at where we should target our programs, much like Ben does. We use a resilience brick indicator that's developed by the Berkeley Lab here at the University of South Carolina. Kind of looks at different capitals for communities to really give them a resilience, kind of a resilience score that we can then use to compare resilience across areas of the state. So that's been something we've been piloting to see how can we measure resilience over time and how our impacts increasing, hopefully increasing resilience as we move forward. So we're really now into just the implementation phase of that plan. We had 50 plus recommendations in the plan, but really we have 4 main pillars of operation right now to implement. First is our watershed-based planning and coordination. We've hired watershed coordinators who are going and engaging with communities to understand where they think their vulnerabilities are, what's important to them, what's important to those communities, so we can then map that and marry it with the data we see at the state level. So more of that bottom-up approach. And then also working to increase the quality of the data we have available for decision-making. That goes from everything from updating our land cover data sets to the new 1 meter resolution land cover, updating LIDAR across portions of the state. We've been talking about doing additional gauging using low-cost sensors to kind of backfill in with USGS gauges, and those are areas we'll continue to try to build up our data sets. We have a grants program to go in and try to bring in as many dollars as possible to implement. Obviously, that's shifted over the last few months, but we've been pretty successful in going out and getting federal dollars to implement a lot of our plan. And then finally, again, focusing on that land conservation and nature-based systems as a way of mitigating against future disasters. And so we prioritize land conservation in areas that give us natural protection from hazards. And luckily, we've had really good support from our legislature and governor on that. And we've been able to start bringing down large portions of kind of floodplain lands or other lands that give us protection from natural hazards. And I think that's it for me here in South Carolina.
Great, thanks so much. Now we're gonna move to Kentucky with Amanda Lemaster.
Hi guys, thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about a few of the activities that we're focused on in Kentucky for energy resilience planning. None of them in a particular order. Some of them are under SEP annual, some are under IIJA, some are under a former BRIC program. So first I'm going to start off with fuel planning, something that our state is looking to work harder on. We had a 2021 tornado come through the state, and that we were very evident during that time. We had a lot of coordination going on throughout that activation because we just didn't really have the partnership and the planning set in place for a fuel plan that would have expedited potentially our situation. So that was just lessons learned. And what we were able to do based on that is work with CISA's resiliency assessment. And what we decided to do was learn more about our fuel infrastructure and how it comes into our state. So we have 22 product terminals, and that's what our study was on. What does that look like for those 22 product terminals coming into the state? And we spent the last year working on it. We've got really good information. Actually, the final report is under review at this time. We've got really good key findings, and what we've done is we have set up a petroleum workshop for our state partners this fall to go over our key findings, see how we can integrate our planning, and then of course eventually not only establish local fuel plans, but ultimately have that state fuel plan that we realized in 2021 was most essential and something that we were lacking across the Commonwealth. So it's one activity we've been working on, very proud of it, and glad to say the outcome of that will be a workshop that will take place. Of course, we'll share the AARPs and everything from that because it could be replicated, of course, from other state energy offices. Second, I'd like to move into our continued energy water nexus. We are in the third round of a switchgear program where we've worked with Kentucky Rural Water Association to identify vulnerable facilities across the state that are in need of backup generation capabilities. And at a minimum, are you able to hook up in the time of need when your facility could be focusing on disruptions? So round 1 and 2 were both under SCP annual. My budget was fairly smaller, and we were able to tackle between those 2 rounds 3 facilities that now are have redundant power backup, so that if and when they need to be hooked up, they have those capabilities. Round 3, I am proud to say that we're doing it under IIJA, and our budget is considerably larger than the first 2 rounds. And what that has done is allowed us to identify up to 20 facilities in round 3 that will be able to purchase and install manual transfer switch at their water and or wastewater facility, which of course, like Ben mentioned earlier, the more we work on mitigation measures now, the less that we have to focus on during the time of disruption, because we've been able to help with redundancy and resiliency at these critical facilities. I will mention the Water Energy Nexus came about during our very, very many activations since 2020, where we realized they are Public Works is who we work with the most when it comes to their energy needs during the time of a disruption. So we continue to prioritize our funding towards this sector, and hopefully before long they'll have become more robust and rely less on us during the time of disruptions because they have what their facility needs for resilience. We're also working as far as the water nexus. We are working with SEPA, the Smart Electric Power Alliance, to do microgrid deployment and installation studies across the state. With our wastewater treatment plants, we've partnered up with the Department of Water. We're doing optimization and energy nutrient audits. And we also did a study over the last 6 months with 3 different wastewater facilities to identify their most critical loads and what an actual microgrid and or nanogrid would look like on their campus. We have finished that round of reporting, and we are looking forward to moving forward with that. What we have found is we have some financial constraints when it comes to a microgrid, and that was something that we came from the study. We didn't think that it would be considerably cheap, but we weren't exactly sure what to expect. So with the funding that we have to move forward in another grant that we're using this report as seed money, we will be working with either Kentucky Rural Water Association altogether and or choose one facility to purchase a portable microgrid that we have identified through 5 or 6 different contractors. So that's been something interesting for us. We thought we were going after a microgrid at a water treatment plant, but it turns out that we're going to dial back a little bit and do a portable microgrid, nonetheless seeking energy resilience at our public works sector. Also with SEPA and the microgrid deployment, we have did a study with 3 universities throughout the Commonwealth on what that looks like at their campus. We've come to find the same thing, the financial constraints, but we were able to dial in on the most critical loads for these facilities, and that will help them when their next steps come along to pursue potential installation. We will be choosing we'll be putting out our abstracts under IIJA as well. So this report is also seed to help with universities apply for our next round, which is to help get an installation of a microgrid at a university in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So that'll be something a first for us. And we have many eager colleges that participated in the study and are eager to move forward with us in the next round. So thirdly, that was our microgrids. And then I'd like to move on to work that we've been doing over the last 5 years in energy mitigation planning and working with our local governments on critical facility energy resilience and vulnerability assessments through the way of surveys. And just like Ben from Tennessee mentioned just a minute ago, we're looking for some basic data, and that basic data is getting the conversation started. It's going to identify where there are weaknesses throughout the Commonwealth in terms of resilient facilities to energy needs. And that's where you have to get started, is where are the problems at the most. So we did a survey. We worked with 15 area development districts that are quasi-governmental, and they are responsible for mitigation planning at the local level. All 15 ads comprise of 120 counties total, 500 plus cities. We were able to successfully adequately receive 15.5% of all the critical facilities listed within our state's hazard mitigation plans. 15.5%, we have really, really adequate responses back from those. And so those cities and counties are just a little bit further along, and now we'll be able to go on to their next steps of figuring out, okay, what else does this look like? But the data that we collected, what the local governments, the emergency managers, economic development planners, mitigation planners, what they were able to do with this data is say, okay, we've done the assessment, we've looked at some of the facilities of what we found, or just basically what we know. Who is the most vulnerable, i.e. what sectors, which facility types, who specifically, facility-wise, is the most vulnerable, and that they want to prioritize future funding for. So they have 120 mitigation actions that we've received as a result of this survey and this BRIC grant, where communities have identified, okay, if you said I had money right now in terms of energy resilience, here is where I would put those dollars towards. I feel like that's bounds and leaps for us. Prior to this grant, the mitigation energy nexus was rather, well, it wasn't there. So the conversation's starting, and now our mitigation plans in Kentucky at the local level will be enhanced to include this type of data. As a carrot to the results that came from the BRIC grant, the 20 facilities that we selected for round 3 with Kentucky Rural Water Association's switchgear program were all identified and established based on what the local officials and emergency response and planners felt were prioritized within those counties. We evaluated those mitigation actions. We pulled away everyone that was water or wastewater related. And of those, then we started categorizing and we're able to pick 20 based on our budget. And so what that really shows for our locals, and this is a really big bound as well, our locals said, oh, you are listening. We did something, we participated, we put our time in, and someone was actually listening. So that was very nice. Maybe a little bit more trust at the local level with some of these guys when I say, hey, it's Amanda and I just want to talk energy. So that's been a very successful thing from the BRIC grant. We're also working with our parks, state parks. We have 44 total, and I believe more than 11 are state owned, and their infrastructure is failing. And they are now being deemed as shelters once again after the devastating 2021 tornadoes that wiped through the state. With that being said, now being deemed a critical facility where before they were more recreational, we have paid attention that we need to focus in and help our parks strengthen up the resiliency of the energy infrastructure so that when we do have displaced citizens, we're not in the news twice. We're also working with our electric municipals under 401(d) as well. We were able to select 3 to go after infrastructure enhancements. We're going to really help them get a more resilient grid for the people that they serve. So that's just a few things that we got going on in terms of energy resilience planning in the state of Kentucky.
That was great, Amanda. I really appreciated hearing those stories. Brian is going to take us to the end of this panel, and stay tuned after this. We have a great utility panel.
Thank you, Lisa. And I agree. I think there's an absolutely great amount of information that's been shared so far by fellow panelists. And I'm super delighted to follow a fellow Commonwealth as well for Kentucky. So hello, everyone. My name is Brian Ritzinger, and I am the Director of the Clean Energy and Resilience Engineering Division at the Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. And I will try to move through my slides a bit quickly so we can have enough time for discussion afterwards. And moving to my next slide, you'll see my quick disclaimer. And my disclaimer essentially says that I'm essentially an unaccompanied minor today. I do not have an attorney sitting next to me to poke me in the leg when I shouldn't say something. So I'm free to speak as I feel fit. Moving to my next slide, we'll see the agenda. And again, I won't spend too much time on this slide because we'll cover each of these items as I address them on their specific slides. So moving to my first slide, we'll have a quick discussion about the Department of Public Utilities. Realizing that we have a diverse panel of stakeholders and attendees, I wanted to give kind of a general overview of what the Department of Public Utilities are, because many people may not have heard of them before. The DPU is overseen by a 3-member commission. Those 3 members are Chair Jamie Van Nostrand and Commissioners Stacy Rubin and Cecile Fraser. They're responsible in part for the oversight of the investor-owned electric power, natural gas, and water utilities within the Commonwealth. And by way of background, I've been with the DPU for about 12 years. I originally started in the electric power division as an engineer. The new division, SEER, and it is pronounced SEER, spelled C-E-R-E, as in we are here to SEER the company's engineers when they submit proposals before the department. The new SEER division was established in January of 2025, and I am the inaugural director. In typical, we regulate the 3 EDCs, which is a term I'll use frequently through my presentation, the electric distribution companies, and those specifically refer to Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil, altogether comprising about 2.7 million electric distribution customers. And moving to my next slide, we'll set the stage and have a quick discussion regarding reliability versus resiliency. For reliability, I think the quick answer is that it's normal operating conditions on a day-to-day or under blue sky performance. Blue sky is a phrase I use a lot. Essentially, when you get home and you flip the light switch, you expect the lights to come on, right? That's reliability. And now resiliency, and I do differ slightly from the definition I was provided by Miles on earlier slides, although I do appreciate his takeaway of the terms withstand and recover. However, for us, resiliency is, again, how well can the grid handle and recover from these two categories. One is unexpected challenges, and those include items such as cyber or terrorist attacks, both of which are very concerning events and both are seemingly on the rise, as well as severe weather events. This can include major storms, hurricanes, wildfires, and extreme heat events. In Massachusetts, we used to just be kind of a bit more concerned about severe winter storms, but we are still subject to hurricanes and tropical storms. And in recent years, we're also starting to have more wildfires as well. The EDCs build and maintain and operate their electric grid. And traditionally, they're the ones charged with providing that reliable electric service. It's actually in their service mandate. Massachusetts is a restructured or unbundled state, contrary to some of our colleagues on the panel today. So the EDCs have a service mandate in order to be a regulated monopoly, and that is that they need to provide safe, reliable, cost-effective, and secure electric service to all of its customers. And in short, the EDC is required for keeping the lights on. However, the DPU, the EDCs, and other state and public safety officials have long been engaged in coordinated storm response, specifically minimizing disruptions to electric service, and particularly those customers. The DPU monitors reliability and resiliency in part through its service quality reports that are submitted by the EDCs, the annual reliability reports, and the emergency response plans. These are all submitted by the EDCs to the DPU, and they're all based on long-standing requirements. And due to the increasing frequency of extreme weather events and the effects of climate change, the DPUs, state legislators, and the EDCs have also increasingly focused attention on ensuring more resilient systems and prepare for future climate-driven impacts. Specifically, we have the electric sector modernization plans. We have the ongoing development of climate vulnerability assessments, which are also discussed in the ESMP proceedings. And we also have our inquiry on updating our SQ guidelines, including the inclusion of resiliency metrics. And these should all be working links. So I welcome anybody to click on the links and follow up with additional information after the presentation. Moving to our next slide, I'll continue my discussion. However, this side on the emergency response aspect for resiliency. So the DPU, and namely the SEER division, along with the EDCs, were continually monitoring the weather forecasting services. So National Weather Service, DTN, and a number of others for the potential for severe weather. Now, we also have no notice and short notice events that come up as well. Tornadoes, we're not sheltered from the effects of tornadoes in our state or our Commonwealth. And we also have other no-notice events that come up as well. However, once a severe weather event is identified and the potential impacts are assessed by each EDC, the EDC then classifies that emergency response based upon a table, and they classify the ERP classification as a result of that. And some of those metrics used are lines of trouble, anticipated number of crews, the number and duration of the outages for their customers. Depending on the severity of the forecast, once it's declared an event, there may be some official reporting requirements that have to come into the department from the EDCs. However, there are a number of storm events that we have that don't trigger that level of formal reporting, so we have more informal reporting. The DPU has worked tirelessly to build a fair amount of transparency, operational transparency with the EDCs in Massachusetts, and that has benefited the electric distribution ratepayers within Massachusetts because we just have a better handle on what's going on, a better understanding what's going on, and we understand what is a reasonable response. And we can communicate all that up through the governor. And once an emergency event is declared, then ESF-12, of which the department is the lead, may get activated. And just to put a finer point on that, the Massachusetts ESF-12 is a very active and very engaged ESF. And when we move to our next slide, I'll continue my discussion briefly on ESF-12. As I mentioned, the DPU is the lead agency for ESF-12 in Massachusetts. The DPU, in its infinite wisdom, has elected me as the lead for ESF-12. And there's a number of activities that we encounter. So during large-scale events, large-scale impact events, the State Emergency Operations Center will open. It's also referred to as the bunker. It is an underground nuclear fallout facility that was built back in the 60s. So it is an underground windowless facility. It's a joy to go there and spend an extended amount of time. Make sure you bring your vitamin E pills. But you know, as I think Ben mentioned earlier, when we're there with DOT, state police, Red Cross, any of the other ESF agencies that are activated, so that we can coordinate a response together. And a lot of that stems from the electric side of the house. However, we also have other large-scale public gathering events, such as the Boston Marathon, where we also get activated. However, in those types of instances, ESF 12 plays more of a support role and less of a lead role because it's not an impact to the electric distribution system. However, we are engaged with other state agencies. We provide hourly outage information. Typically, once we cross 25,000 customer outages statewide, but we also participate in a number of weather calls, statewide briefing calls, planning calls. The EDCs certainly have their role to play in securing and mobilizing external crews, sending out their notifications to life support customers, opening their own emergency operations centers, and certainly activating their community liaisons to reach out to their communities and their points of contact. So that way there's a good through line of communication from the affected communities all the way up through the company and also to the state, should they need support. And then when we move to our next slide, I'll briefly cover our service quality reporting. And the EDCs and DPU rely on two industry standards, which Miles again covered earlier, and that's the System Average Interruption Duration Index, or SAIDI, and the System Average Interruption Frequency Index, or SAIFI. SAIDI and SAIFI are pretty standard, and they can be used to measure the entire system or a smaller scale. So you can use a smaller time horizon, you can use a smaller component, and you can make these measurements and report them. The EDCs do report on SAIDI and SAIFI annually to the department via their SQ dockets. Since 2020, that was a year with significant number of non-exclusive events. On my next slide, you'll see some graphs. That's why I chose this date. EDCs have shown consistent SAIDI performance and steady improvement in SAIFI. A utility's size, geography, age, characteristics, so on, can all have an impact on our SAIDI and SAIFI, in addition to a number of other factors. And reporting indicates that environmental justice communities tend to have better reliability performance on average across all the three EDCs. Moving to my next slide, this is my I like picture slide. So basically everything I just said on the last slide is what you can see on these graphs here. 2020 had a number of non-excludable storm events, and you can see over the course of time, over the last 5 years, you can see everything coming back into focus again, where we want to see it. And now moving to my next slide, we'll quickly discuss what is resiliency planning. So I think a lot of our colleagues from the other states had a similar kind of definition and understanding for this, but this is planning to cost effectively reduce the risk of outages caused by extreme weather events, right? And that's either identification and evaluation of risk areas, targeted and surgical approach for projects, or prioritize projects to reduce risk. The electric distribution companies are currently developing climate vulnerability assessments to identify risks that climate change poses to the electric distribution system, and that resiliency strategies are developed to mitigate these risks based upon the targeted locations and solutions that derive from these studies. In addition, the CVAs may also help shape standards for future infrastructure. Recent legislation requires the EDCs to prepare climate vulnerability resiliency plans for their next ESMP filings, which are due in 5 years. The Department of Energy Resources, a sister agency to the DPU, have worked together to prepare a vulnerability risk assessment, or VRA, as part of the State Energy Security Plan. And all of this then feeds into my next slide, which are some of the resilience improvements. So the resilience improvements identified by the electric distribution companies include storm resiliency vegetation hazard tree removal programs, targeted spacer cable installation, targeted undergrounding, and projects prioritized based upon cost per saved customer minute of interruption and cost per saved customer interruption. For example, Eversource identified numerous potential resiliency projects in their recent electric sector modernization plan filing. And Eversource teams are continuing to work internally to refine these projects on a case-by-case basis. And that's based on the guidance that the DPU provided when it issued its order in August of 2024 for the ESMP, including a cost effectiveness requirement. And this really leads to the specific instance I want to describe where Eversource proposed on the 480B line as a year one undergrounding project. This was an area with multiple issues. It was all bare wire construction, non-Eversource maintained poles. So in Massachusetts, we have poles that can be jointly owned, or they can be owned by, they're either jointly owned with Verizon, or they may be solely owned by Verizon. That can lead to some operational and maintenance challenges. Certainly can lead to some storm restoration challenges as well. But in this specific instance, those poles were non-Eversource maintained, and there was also limited capacity through the manual ties, and it supplied 2 4 kV circuits. So they anticipated rebuilding the entire backbone with spacer cable. So that should lead to a more resilient project, cost effectively, and provide better benefits to its customers. And that's just a small example of what we have going on. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. And if everybody can come back on camera on the panel. We're going to get to a couple questions that were posed in the chat and Q&A box, as well as questions that we have for the presenters. So first up, how are states taking into account the sufficiency in supply chains in the event of emergencies?
I'm off mute, so I guess I'll just start speaking.
Great.
So yeah, supply chain issues are a concern here in Massachusetts. In fact, I mentioned the annual reliability reports. As part of those filings, the department meets individually with the companies. Last week, we happened to meet with both Eversource and National Grid separately. And this is one of the topics that we came up with for discussion, right? What's the status of supply chain? What's going on? The reality is that for our larger EDCs, both Eversource and National Grid, they cover multiple states with their service territory. So they actually have a fairly large stockpile of resources that they can construct, and they can easily transfer these materials around because it's all within the Northeast, really within New England, but I'll just say the Northeast. But beyond that, the companies are well aware of the supply chain issues, so they're starting to plan for us again for that winter kind of storm season that we have. They're starting to plan for that, well in advance, right? So you're not going to wait until December to start going out to the market to say, hey, we need to buy a bunch of pole top transformers, right? Because that's not going to get you anywhere. So they already started that well in advance, and we start to maintain those stockpiles well in advance of those seasons. Thank you.
Great. Any comments from any of the other states on this one? We've got lots of other questions too. All right, I'm going to move on. This is just a light question. With the recent reductions in federal workforce, such as the National Weather Service and FEMA, are states prepared, or how are you preparing to have the funds and expertise to manage the potential additional responsibilities to ensure adequate resilience of infrastructure for electricity? Easy question, softball.
I'll chime
Well,
in on.
go ahead.
I'll just chime in for South Carolina. We do have a working group that's having discussions about planning for how do we deal with any shift in how federal dollars are coming down. From the data sets that come from the federal side, we're also looking, can we supplement those? I mentioned the Bridge Rocks program to try to supplement USGS river gauges, but we're looking at other kind of lower cost data supplementals to try to fill in any gaps that may arise. But yeah, it's an ongoing discussion that's happening here in South Carolina.
So I'll be quick. One of the ways we're going to supplement that is our state legislator approved funding for a statewide mesonet weather stations in each county, modeled after some of our other states like Kentucky and Oklahoma and others do there. So that's going to give us county level data, and we're working on where we can cite those and feasibility studies to identify different locations that can help with that. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest, which also part of the justification we sold the legislator on is that helps with grid resilience, because that also helps TVA understand and the local power company to understand weather conditions down to the county level instead of just having to rely on higher level stations.
Lisa,
Lisa,
you're on mute. Sorry.
Ooh, thanks. What is the biggest policy or regulatory barrier, in your view, to mitigating the effects of severe storms?
affordability. Does that count? I mean, that's, I think, one of the major barriers we have, right? We can implement everything we want, but if it's just going to break the backs of all the ratepayers, then it's just not really feasible, right? So trying to walk that fine point of what's the appropriate amount of investment to reduce the impact, reduce the advantages, reduce the duration, while still having people be affordable and be able to enjoy their lives.
Right. I mean, trade-offs with the actual event, so what the impacts will be. Amanda, Ben, Alex? Biggest policy or regulatory barrier to mitigating the impacts of severe storms?
Yeah, I'll echo what Brian said. I mean, making sure that we're finding that right balance and making sure we're accounting for future costs when we're considering those cost benefit analysis, and that's something that's difficult to really quantify for us at this point.
And I think some of that is trying to also have those past costs, and it's still, I preach this all the time. It's trying to understand, have better metrics that show the benefit of mitigation and resilience investment. It's really hard to measure the impact of something not happening, and so that's what I think is still one of the biggest, not regulatory or policy hurdles. That's one of the more scientific hurdles, is
Right.
trying to understand, if we had better data, then better ways to measure resilience and what those metrics are, and then agree to those to some across the board. I think that would help folks understand why mitigation and resilience investment is so critical and important in the first place. But it's really hard to justify, hey, I want to spend money on this something so it doesn't happen. Then when it doesn't happen, proving that investment paid off. That's
Right.
the fundamental question in all of this. That's still a scientific question and academic, that we need lots more policy and help producing better results there.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I think Ben's correct. I think there's an educational component to the avoided cost concept, right? Spent a bunch of money. This didn't impact the way it should have. Great. Now, is it because you spent the money or because this wasn't as impactful? So something we wrestle with as well.
All right. All right, I have a question for you, Brian, and anyone else. Are you in Massachusetts considering supplemental metrics to SAIDI and SAFE for resilience, such as including major events?
We have an open NOI, notice of investigation, where that topic may or may not be further pursued.
That was a good, concise answer. Anybody else want to talk about the metrics, maybe in like TVA's IRP, or I don't know what they're doing on resilience in their IRP. Probably nothing. The local distribution companies, Ben, do they use some supplemental metrics?
I don't know those well enough to really opine much on it. On that, some of the local power companies that have really advanced smart metering, like in Chattanooga and Knoxville, Jackson, the ones that do have the more advanced metering there, are able to have some supplemental data, from what I've heard, and Chattanooga's been able to even use that for a resiliency grant themselves to help justify a microgrid project for basically their first responder campus, and so that I think that's where you can see that is the more advanced local power companies with better resources are using some more metrics. And I think the challenge is, how do you help that small rural one that has a couple dozen employees and is a city power company, basically? How do you help them have additional metrics so that they can go after these kind of funding opportunities? That to me is the real challenge.
Great. My favorite question: to what extent is grid resilience planning coordinated with other types of planning in your state? Could be distribution planning, could be IRP. I know in Massachusetts, you've got the electric sector modernization plans, Brian.
Yes, we're definitely going down the path of integrated energy planning at this point. Prior to the ARRs, back when we were a vertically integrated state, we had integrated resource planning that changed when we became restructured. Now we have the ARRs, but now we're focusing again through the SMPs on integrated energy planning. And I think one of the questions there is, at what point do you stop, right? So when you are an unbundled state, do you just do it through the distribution system? Do you do the transmission separately and have two inputs to each other? Do the whole thing all at once?
All right. Alex, in South Carolina, you've got Duke doing some form of integrated system planning.
Yeah, and Duke clearly crosses state boundaries as well. So, I think we're still kind of trying to figure that out. How do we best integrate those two processes? We work closely with our energy office on a number of issues, and then through the utilities directly as well. But I think it's still a process of trying to figure out how do we best help the work that they're doing and then incorporate the work that they're doing at the utility level into some of our state plans. We're still trying to work that out.
We have a question from the audience. Is the embedded software, malware in imported equipment and electronics still an ongoing concern? Anybody have thoughts on that? Discussion in your state, among your utilities? Relying on the federal government? All right. Well, we don't have an answer for that one, but thanks for your question.
I can say that TVA has a really robust software program that helps reach out to the local power companies with questions like that and to help them when they want supplemental, as well as the state as a designated cybersecurity agent that actually is working with some of our utilities on a pilot program with a really different firewall approach to things that is still piloting, that don't have any results yet to talk about.
All right. Great. Thanks. All right. What is the biggest success story so far in your state's storm mitigation efforts? Amanda, you were telling a good story about, you're building trust in that community. I think that's a good story. Do you have another one, or you want to build on that further?
We're going to continue working specifically with communities based on the stuff that we found in the reports. And I think they're actually more, I think they're actually more eager that we're at the table than annoyed. And sometimes mitigation is this word that people are like, yeah, you say it's out there, but am I really going to get it? Just because it's a prolonged process. So super eager about that. Also been heavily working with our electric municipals on outage management systems and procuring the software to actually have a statewide full outage. One of my goals, if I leave ever, which I don't plan on, but one of the goals for the state is, as the state energy assurance coordinators, to have 100% outage coverage during the time of disruptions. And right now we're about 4% shy of that goal. And over the last 4 years, we've closed the gap. So for me, and there's many things to mention, but to me, the relationship building with our electrical munis, and then just helping them find the funding or establish what it means to have that system. And it's more of a benefit than just outages to the eagle eye scraping. It's a huge benefit to their whole service territory. So just working with them and them kind of coming back and saying, hey, by the way, Miss Lemaster, I did it. I've got it. Now what do I need to do? That's been pretty rewarding for me at the state level.
Great. Alex, what about you? Do you have a particular success story for storm mitigation?
Yeah, I think for us, it does tie back into that, getting folks to understand the interconnection between how we're shaping our landscape and the impacts that has downstream from a flooding perspective. We have a priority here in the state to put a lot more of our acreage under conservation, and we've been able to prioritize where we're doing that based on how it's going to benefit our flooding impacts, including grid impacts. So I think having that information available has been a real success, and we're starting to see some real buy-in from our legislature and others.
Great. Ben?
So the first thing is getting the state EMA we work together to develop an ESF-12 dashboard that they run 24 hours a day. And the success of it was one Sunday when I was going to be activated and I was about to head out of town, and I said, hey, I'm not going to be able to come in, but I can watch it remotely. And they said, hey, I don't need you overnight. I can look at power outages without you. And I was like, that is one of those things, Amanda, like you, that I had always dreamed of achieving, is that they can monitor it even without me at this point. But the other one is finally getting The dock level, this is very specific mitigation because it's all relationship built. It wasn't any actual actions other than prevention, and that we got the dock level that one of the fuel terminals, what level the river through downtown Nashville, when it reaches, they have to shut the dock down. And then getting the Corps of Engineers to literally be able to hold back water below that to keep the water from rising above that level, that the fuel terminal still operated. So in April, we did that. We found out the level finally. The Corps was able to hold back the water. And yeah, it's an amazing engineering story. They literally held back the river so that downtown didn't flood enough that that dock was able to still operate and fuel was able to still flow. So that's a huge win. No one will ever read about it. And how do you measure that other than people still had fuel in fuel terminals and tanks were still filling and nobody else knew it happened? As I say, if we really do our jobs right, nobody really knows we're doing it. And that's kind of the beauty of good civil service.
That's great. That was a great story. Brian, last word, success story from Massachusetts.
I think for us, it'd be the level of competency and engagement that we've built for our ESF 12 in Massachusetts. I like to say that we're the gold standard, but then again, I'm the one that's lead for it, so it's easy for me to say that. But the level of operational transparency that we've built with the companies has benefited electric repairs tremendously. I mean, just for us, it all starts with communication, right? So us being able to have communications back and forth with the company, knowing who to contact, understanding what they're saying, knowing what we were looking for, be able to share that up through our administration, and also to send that out also to our emergency management agency, which then sends it to all of our 351 towns and communities in Massachusetts, so they all have the same level of situational awareness and they know what's going on. Yeah, that just helps customers, right? You want to know what's going on, how long is it going to be for, and when can I get back to kind of regular life, and we really try to bridge that divide.
That's great. All right, I want to thank you all for participating in our state's panel. It was terrific. And Miles, back to you for the utility panel.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks very much. That was great information and discussion from our state's panelists. I'm very excited to be introducing our final session here. This is Utility Resilience Plans and Projects. We have three fantastic panelists. First, we'll hear from Nelson Yip, who's the Director of Strategic Planning at Consolidated Edison. We'll next hear from Cynthia Klein, who's the Director of Enterprise Strategy and Planning at Duke Energy, and then from Elder Romero, who is the Senior Manager of Advanced Planning at Avangrid. We will then take questions from the audience, and so I will kick it off here with Nelson. And Nelson, I'll share your slides.
Sure.
Right here.
Miles, can you hear me?
Yes.
Got it. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nelson Yip. As Miles talked about, this has been such a really good and insightful session. I sat through this to kind of see the different frameworks all coming together, and as well as the last panel, looking at how the state and different entities look through and work through. I heard collaboration, I heard community, I heard making sure that we as a group think about data-driven resilience planning. So next slide, Miles. So for those of you that I know, there's a lot of stakeholders here. Our company is the utility that energizes New York. So it's the place in blue. It's mostly a coastal city, but we also have a sister company in Orange and Rockland. For Con Edison of New York, we have 3.7 million customers, really small, 660 square miles, but that whole blue area is 40% of the state's energy load, is about 14,000 megawatts. We also deliver gas to our 1.1 million customers, as well as steam, which is 1,500 customers. So one building could be as iconic as the Empire State Building. And so all of these infrastructure facilities have to be resilient moving forward. Miles, next slide. So I think, as we draw to close, to think about all the different things we talked about as an EDC or as an energy company, we're really thinking about not just resilience as one piece of everything, as by itself, but it's also climate change is equal to resilience and the decarbonization piece. So as a utility, we're thinking about meeting societal goals, thinking about customer expectations, but also at the base, really thinking about world-class safety, reliability, physical and cybersecurity, and all these other things moving forward. But what drives everything is we talked, I think Brian was talking about integrated long-range planning. It's really thinking about all the different things from industry, stakeholders, and social trends that really leads to strategy, actions, and investments to really head towards the energy transition. So one of them, on the left is really thinking through, what do our customers, what do our communities want? What are our stakeholders, policy officials, regulators? What are the expectations moving forward? That's really important. The other thing is we do see, more extreme events in a changing environment. And then also we talked about this, in a couple of the states, there's clean energy, but also resilience legislation. So, I'll talk a little bit later about how in New York, we had in 2022 resilience legislation where the 6 electric utilities had to work on vulnerability studies and resilience plans, but it's really supplementing a lot of the things that we've been doing. And then also New York State, we've had different names for it, but really there's a framework on making sure that we also think about community impacts and considerations, especially New York State's disadvantaged communities. So really looking through that, it's thinking about, for us, resilience is increased resilience to adapt to climate change, but it's also thinking about, we also have to make sure that we are helping enable net zero GHG emission goals by 2050, thinking about, everyday reliability and also resiliency after major events. And also, how do we think about the cross-cutting items, including having customers at the center of all the things that we're doing? Next slide, Miles. So, every utility has, as a company, we're committed to thinking about physical climate risks, thinking about system resilience. And then for us, we're preventing, mitigating, responding to the impacts of the things that we're seeing. But I think every utility has a defining event, as we've heard. Ours was Superstorm Sandy in October of 2012. One of the largest, 1.4 million of our customers, lost power. But it's really, what did we do afterwards, right? We thought about $1 billion invested in infrastructure after Superstorm Sandy. But we also said, in terms of how do we think about these $1 billion moving forward? How do we think about working with stakeholders? We had a working group of about 50. How are you thinking about making these investments moving forward? How are you thinking about the things that you're investing in versus like building back, better or higher, or thinking, what are you using? So it's really from 2017 through 2019, we were one of the earlier utilities to think through a climate change vulnerability study. Engineers, what are the things that you needed to post Sandy, review to make sure that you thought about higher walls, seawalls? How do you think about, the electrical grid, even our gas system and our steam system? And it really took through, a little bit longer because we wanted to make sure we engaged New York City, we engaged different environmental groups, labor groups, and then also we heard a lot about universities. We engaged with Columbia University to work with us to think through what do the global data models mean? But then how do we make sure that we have the data for our service territory, and how do we downscale it appropriately to be able to look at our assets? And then it's more the things that are really important, but then, the things that we need to do to kind of get change, right? To build it into our DNA is really to think through how do we have governance? How do we look into our specifications for planning, design, operations, and really resiliency as an emergency response. So this is like part of our journey, but then it's also, we have data, we have looking at our assets, but then it's also how do you do it for long-term planning? And then for us, it's the general rate case, the rate case process. And then we talked about the law before. It's really thinking through and a really good, robust relationship with our New York State regulators to think through, we're working with them and NYSERDA, our research authority, to kind of come up with the data. But then it's also how do we have a comprehensive roadmap for resilience investments, and how do we think about that and work on that together? And it's really about continued integration. Next slide, Miles. So I think one thing is that when we did our 2023 study, it's that one of the learnings was, the sea level rise continues to be a concern for us, but that heat impacts that you've seen may occur sooner than previously anticipated. So for example, historically, it's 4 days over 95 degrees in our service territory. By 2030, 17 days. and then by 2050 up to 32 days. So it's really, it's 7 times more, thinking that's almost 1/3 of our summer, where we have to think about heat impacts on our people, heat impacts on the public, heat impacts on our equipment and infrastructure. Those are the things that we've been continuing to look at in our plans. Continued heat waves from 2 to 6 to 9, but then also thinking about, not just, it's not the amount of precipitation over 3, 4, 5, based on this chart. It's really the deluge rain. So we've had examples of 8 to 9 in our West Point service territory, 8 to 9 inches of rain in 7 hours. So it's really the deluge rain, intense rain, and how do we think about that big bursts of rain moving forward. And then for us, sea level rise is at least 16 inches of sea level rise in our service territory. So we've changed some of our design standards from a FEMA 100-year storm to 3 foot of sea level rise plus 2 feet of freeboard. So a FEMA plus 5 to standard. And then finally, climate change is not, climate science is not perfect. So, and thinking about this topic, extreme weather events, it's what we can say is there will be an increase in frequency and intensity of certain extreme weather events, like long duration heat waves and deluge rainfalls. But we need to continue to do more studies like wind and ice and other things moving forward. But at least directionally, we know there will be more, but we need to continue to study, and we will every 5 years. Next slide. So we talked a lot about this. I know Miles talked about his framework. For us, it's not a new framework as well. It's hardening, but thinking about projected climate conditions to prevent outages, to think about mitigation, some technologies. So how do we have flexibility or adaptability to mitigate disruptions to customers? And then even the last piece, which is building on robust energy management and preparedness, really thinking through our response to extreme weather with extreme weather and exercises in mind. Next slide. So for us, I think it's more, what happens when we, can kind of come through from data to engineering and investments. It's really thinking about what type of data are we getting? What are the pathways we're using? So for us, it's the socioeconomic pathways. 8.5 are things that we're thinking about as sea level rise, temperature, precipitation. But it's really, what's our risk tolerance? What in terms of what is New York's, our municipality? So what is our New York City doing? What is New York State doing? What are our ports, our airports, our trains? People who are around us. For resilience is a shared responsibility, but in terms of resilience, we want to make sure that we're moving along together. So you don't want to be overly resilient, and you don't want to be under resilient, so because then you'll be the weakest link. You also have to think about what, based on your evaluation of risk, what are the variables that matter to you, right? We talked about that in a chart before, but how do we think about translating that into affecting engineering design standards? How does it inform your design standards to make investments moving forward? And then how do you look at that when you make really long-lived or long-term projects in terms of everything? So transformers, substations, et cetera. So really leading to making sure that things that we're doing new build is future-proofed, replacement is built up to the latest standards, and then for critical or proactive areas, proactive replacements as appropriate and needed. Next slide. So really, based on our filed 2025 climate change resilience plan, we proposed about a $645 million plan over 5 years, and even a roadmap of about $5.3 billion to really look at prevent, mitigate, respond. But some of the things that I'll talk about, you'll see here, I'll talk about 5 of them. Next slide, Miles. So some of the things in terms of for extreme weather, we've talked about this before, whether it's targeted or selective undergrounding, is really thinking through overhead distribution circuits to converting to underground. Really the benefits are thinking about customer outages and overall storm restoration time, looking at the right trunk feeders to kind of make sure, or circuits to kind of underground, working with communities to think through things and analyzing the different areas. The other ones, we've heard about resilience hubs, potentially, critical facilities. That's building on things that, the energy utility have been thinking about, but then also having a lens of, how do we harden the non-network overhead circuits, thinking about areas that might have community value. So for example, as we talked about, hospitals, shelters, resilience hubs, EOCs, But that's really looking at it in terms of doing more to think through adverse weather conditions. And then I think 3 more. So the primary feeder resiliency is thinking about the mitigation aspect, right? It's really, are there next generation interrupter switches? Are there ways to minimize outages to smaller amounts of people? And then even bifurcating, basically kind of thinking through creating extra lines to increase system capacity, really for extreme heat and cascading and reducing outages that way. Next slide. And as you see from the picture in New York City, there is a lot of coastal, but also that we have to really also think about intense precipitation. So a lot of the things that we're proposing are also mitigating equipment damage from rising sea levels, inland flooding. So substation hardening, all across the country, right? It's to raise assets, flood barriers, relocating control rooms to like potentially the second floor, thinking about ways to build resilience in the beginning and not looking at it from the end. But it's also thinking about what are the potential equipment failures based on experience, and also potentially saying, if we're looking at new extreme events happening, how are we thinking about this moving forward? And then even this, which is, adding more in terms of erosion protection, both on our substations, but then also around the areas around pooling water around during extreme storms, during some of our service centers and service stations. Next slide. All this comes back to, I think this is really what the venue is, and then going back to the framework of stakeholder engagement. So if you start from the top, it's really, engaging stakeholders early, talking through expectations and goals. And I think we have a lot of shared goals with policies, officials, municipalities, states, and then also EDCs, and also gas distribution companies and others. But I've heard a lot of themes throughout the whole day, which was, thinking about who can we team up with locally, right? It doesn't have to be Columbia. It could be, talk about Tennessee, you could talk about national labs. And it's really, we don't, necessarily know a lot of the things in the beginning. And so we had to work with people. We had to create a group. But it's also thinking about what's the common good in terms of we're fortifying infrastructure to prevent and shorten outages, but then it's also public safety, no matter how you think about it, right? So public safety is also important, as is affordability. But it's also, we talk about our frameworks, right? What's the framework? What's the strategy? But then it's also, there's value and there's benefits of resilience investments. And there's more to kind of flesh out in that area. And then finally, just community considerations, right? No matter, how you say it, I think we're working through and thinking about communities and being resilient and customers, but you have to think about them, in terms of long-term planning, in terms of in the middle of things, post-storm recovery. So all these things at all steps, you have to think about how do we consider communities, especially as, if to the extent that there is an energy transition in some of your states, or more so than others. It's how do we, if we touch something in the ground, we want to make sure that it's also adding system capacity and being more resilient to different events that may be occurring. Next slide. So I think I want to end with, there's building resilience is a shared goal. This whole day was about collaboration, learning, sharing, lots of input, peers, regulators, planners, labs, universities, and many others. But as utilities first have to make sure that they're resilient, but then they also communicate to the stakeholders to make sure that, in a way, there has to be a call to action from all the various groups. And then also customers and others should really think about their own adaptation solutions and resilience plans, just like every household or every state has to think about emergency plans. But the forums like this, it's multi-stakeholder collaboration, different cross sectors. We heard a lot about water and electricity. I think there's water, electricity, gas, steam, like all of these things are really important to make sure that we look at coincident items, aligned items, and also things that affect each other. So I continue to talk to infrastructure owners in the area to make sure that we talk to the water, talk to different officials, including insurance, to really think through, what is the macro view of things moving forward. And so the rest of the slides is really just links, but Miles, I wanted to pass it over to you or to Cynthia to kind of maybe engage on a different part of the country.
Thanks so much, Nelson. That was wonderful. As I pull up Cynthia's slides, I'll just note that if that generated any questions, you can put them into the Q&A box, and we'll address them after Cynthia and Elder present. So let me pull up this presentation. I'll share my screen.
Perfect. And Miles, can everyone hear me still too?
Yes, coming through loud and clear.
Excellent. You're welcome to flip to the next slide, please. That would be great. Good afternoon, everyone. So as mentioned, I'm Cynthia Klein with Duke Energy. Nelson said it so eloquently. This has been such a fantastic forum, and I really appreciate the very collaborative spirit in this space. So thank you all for pulling this together. So before we get into our climate resilience plans and projects, I wanted to share a little bit about Duke Energy for those who may not be as familiar. So Duke is one of the largest energy holding companies in the US with over 150 plus years of dedicated service to our customers. And we operate assets that generate 55 gigawatts and have electric customers across 6 states. So Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. And I appreciate that all of our states are well represented today. So big thanks to Alex and Amanda online too. And last year, by the end of the 2024 hurricane season, there were 18 named storms, 11 hurricanes, 5 of which were major, so category 3 or above, and one in particular that impacted every one of our 6 states from Florida to Indiana. So Hurricane Helene made a landfall in Florida as a category 4 in, oh, you could stay on that one, thanks. The first slide, the one before, on September 26th, bringing storm surges to areas from Tampa Bay to the Florida Panhandle, and from there it moved across Georgia and into western North Carolina before dissipating across our western states. As much as 30 inches of rain fell in parts of the Carolinas, which was a deluge of rain over 4 days that turned creeks into roaring rivers, causing massive flooding, which washed out almost entire towns, some of which still aren't open to the public as of today. So we had 20,000 workers helping restore power to our customers, and we replaced more than 16,000 poles and over 10 million feet of wire just from that event. And Miles, if you go to the next slide too, that context setting just really shows that climate resilience studies for us, like Nelson and all the rest of the presenters talked about, they aren't just theoretical. It's going to continue to help us make data-driven decisions to best support our customers, in the time of need. So we've been analyzing our climate vulnerabilities before the historic 2024 hurricane season. And although this is a continuing evolving field, as Miles mentioned before at the top of this meeting, during storms, our teams are really prepared to activate. So Duke Energy initiated our first climate resilience and climate risk and resiliency study. That's what you see in the left in the blue. And that was of the North and South Carolina transmission and distribution systems. We initiated that back in 2021 with the final report findings published in September of 2023 on our climate resilience and adaptation website, which I encourage you all to explore. I'll have the links on the last slide of my presentation. And actually, the new one just went live today, so very excited for you all to check that out. The purpose of that study was to systematically assess the vulnerability of our T&D assets and operations to the projected physical impacts of extreme weather, and develop, we've talked about this a lot too, a flexible framework to inform those continued investments in North and South Carolina's T&D system. And the study focused on a 2050 timeframe. We used a third-party consultant, ICF. They led the research and analysis, engaged with our Duke Energy SMEs across the organization. And similar to, as Nelson was mentioning before too, our stakeholders are just a really integral part of developing that initial framework, and included dozens of governmental, academic, customer, and advocacy groups. I think some may be on the line now, so big thanks to everyone for that too. And then in green on the right-hand side, we followed the same approach as the Carolinas T&D study and expanded the scope, working with Guidehouse to assess the vulnerability of our generation. So this new study has generation as well as T&D to climate hazards across all of our territories, and that resulted in our enterprise climate resilience and adaptation study, and we released that back in December of 2024, and it's also published on our website. So on the next slide, I won't belabor this too much, as the methodology for these studies were really similar to the approach that Nelson and the team at Con Ed took. And I have to give a big shout out and thank you to Nelson and his team. They were great partners as we were developing this study, as they mentioned kind of beforehand. So our study focused on the plausible future climate events for 5 different hazards in 2050: high temperature and extreme heat, extreme cold and ice, flooding, precipitation, and high wind events. So hurricanes and storms. Nelson had mentioned before, tornadoes, ice still evolving from a climate science perspective. But those are ones we continue to analyze. So on the next slide, I wanted to share a little bit more, though, about the climate forecasting and variances between our Carolinas T&D and Enterprise study. So similar to Nelson, we examined a range of scenarios of climate forecasting. For our first Carolina study initiated in 2023, we leveraged the RCPs, which are the representative concentration pathways that's used by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So RCPs used by the IPCC for climate modeling in their 5th assessment report describe different concentrations of greenhouse gases and radioactive forces, but didn't include the socioeconomic factors. So Nelson had mentioned this a little bit before. One of the recommendations from the Carolinas report was to evaluate any updates to the climate forecasting. So we leveraged the latest SSPs, or shared socioeconomic pathways, for the Enterprise report, and also evaluated how the RCPs and SSPs from the 2 studies corresponded. So SSPs define the different baseline narratives of what reductions in emissions may or may not achieve based on factors like population, economic growth, climate policy, and technological advancements. And there is a correspondence between the 2, and that's what you can see kind of on that table to the left. For example, the SSP2 corresponds to the RCP 4.5, or a 7.7 degree temperature rise by 2100. So for our Enterprise study, Jupiter Intelligence actually provided downscaled climate forecast per asset by hazard for SSPs, and that enabled us to get the regionally specific vulnerability analysis. So to provide for a range of vulnerabilities and scenarios, our studies leveraged SSP 1 2.6, which is RCP 2.6, SSP 2, RCP 4.5, and SSP 5 8.5. And then our study results showed the vulnerabilities for each of these 3 climate scenarios. And so in the next slide, in addition to asset vulnerabilities, we also examine the severity of impact on our planning processes and operations. So by hazard, rising temperatures and extreme heat, cold, flooding, and wind are the climate hazards that are expected to create the greatest vulnerabilities for planning and operations, while cold weather, particularly coupled with high winds, can have broad impacts on a number of our different functions. So by process and operations, we've got fuel supply and storage, reliability planning, capacity, and our integrated resource plans and grid operations have the highest risk, in part just due to the number of different climate hazards that could impact those activities, both acute and chronic, and in part to the intensity of the vulnerabilities. Asset management that you see, which is Duke Energy's processes to monitor, repair, replace, and augment equipment and systems, those are at a medium risk, and that's due to potential for accelerated equipment aging and vulnerabilities such as climate impacts on failure rates. The severity of acute impacts such as flooding and wind tend to skew towards operational capacities, and chronic long-term hazards such as kind of extreme heat and cold, those skew more towards the planning functions. And I will note that the study results were an independent verification, and they don't actually reflect any mitigation strategies that were being implemented. We wanted to have a baseline of what the immediate impacts would be on those climate and planning scenarios. So next, on the next slide, I wanted to take a quick example of an asset vulnerability assessment. So on this slide, I have the example of the Carolinas. And I know we have attendees from across our regions, and you can find all the vulnerabilities in the study in the Enterprise report that's on our website that I mentioned, but I wanted to share a few key takeaways from our other states. So taking that worst case scenario we analyzed, which is that SPP 8.5 climate scenario, which corresponds to the 4.4 degrees Celsius rise in temperature by the year 2100, I'll start first with Ohio and Kentucky. I know Amanda mentioned some of the vulnerabilities and work going on in Kentucky, but from our analysis for Ohio and Kentucky, with that 8.5 climate scenario, while currently none of our Ohio and Kentucky assets are exposed to more than 20 days of extreme heat in a year, that number increases to about 90% of assets in 2050, and flood-related runoff and stream heights are expected to rise. Moving to Indiana, extreme heat stress, there's about 68% of our assets would be exposed to over 20 days of extreme heat, and so that's days exceeding 100 degrees by 2050. And the flood risk in the Midwest is driven mostly by flash floods from excessive rainfall, and that's expected. This is an interesting one. The flash flood frequency is expected to decline, while the severity is expected to grow, though the former will outpace the latter. So while the change in risk is negligible, understanding that you could have that higher severity level is helpful when you're making some of these planning arrangements. And so for Florida, extreme heat stress is expected to increase by 2050. Florida assets are set to experience a median value of 1.2 days exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the increase in extreme heat days beyond 2025 reaches 19.1 days by 2100. And the number of assets facing more than 4 feet of flooding increases from 6.7% in 2020 to 8.7% in 2050 for a 100-year flood event. And surface-mounted equipment is the asset most impacted, obviously, by flooding. Again, those are all for the 8.5 scenario. And back to the Carolinas example that you see on the slide. So heavy rainfall during heavy downpours could increase the potential for flash flooding, which we all saw this last hurricane season, and that impacts substations in particular located in existing floodplains, as well as substations and transmission structures and regions susceptible to landslides. And I know Alex mentioned some of this before and the importance of having that resiliency planning around flooding. So temperatures and extreme heat are also expected to increase across the Carolinas over the coming decades. And this extreme heat projection leads me to one of the examples we're working on to adapt these study findings. And I know Lisa mentioned extreme heat webinars. This may be a first of a few examples you all will hear from this series. But on the next slide, and actually, before I get to this project, I wanted to give a big acknowledgement to our North Carolina State Energy Office. I believe they're on the line too. I wanted to share a project that was proposed as a result of the Carolinas T&D climate resiliency study. That was the one we published first. That was published in September of 2023. So the North Carolina State Energy Office, in partnership with Duke Energy, submitted an application as part of the GRID. So for those who are familiar with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IAJ, the GRIP Awards, Topic Area 3. And last summer, the DOE awarded the North Carolina State Energy Office a $57 million award for innovative climate resilience transmission build. So this is for our existing Lead-in-Mill Burney 230 kV line in eastern North Carolina. It's a 1979 vintage 35-mile transmission line. It has, I'll nerd out for just a second, traditional 1272 aluminum conducted steel reinforced conductors and H-frame structures. And the updated line is actually going to be a climate resiliency design using advanced high temperature. So it goes from a 541 megavolt amperes up to 1194. Low sag conductors that were actually recommended by the DOE, and double circuit steel monopole structures. And so taking that analysis of the extreme heat and what would allow us to get more electrons, reconductoring a brownfield line where we can bring, renewables to city centers. So this is just one example of how we're leveraging this study, being proactive with new builds as we continue forward. So on the next slide, I wanted to share an example of our adaptation to storms, and in particular, the anticipated flooding. So our Florida power line battery, it's anticipated to be in service in 2027. It's a fast responding resource, so it's going to enhance the overall reliability and resiliency of the Florida electric grid. The battery will be located in Citrus County, Florida. where it will be very valuable during storms and is going to support grid capacity. And so while this enterprise study identified regional areas that I talked about beforehand, our engineering team identified this battery as a good candidate for a Florida-specific site hydrology study that we can get really detailed into the floodplains. And what this data-driven approach did was looked at both ravine and coastal-driven flooding, including hurricanes, identified the site to be elevated above the 500-year floodplain. That way it's actually really protecting that resource, in particular thinking about when our customers need it the most, which is during storms. So with that, I can get to my final slide. So, building and maintaining this really resilient system in the face of changing climate and extreme weather is really foundational for us to meet the needs of our customers when they need it the most. So along with climate resiliency designs, we're also looking at technologies. We've got next generation advanced storage systems at our historic Swanee site. We have a DeBerry hydrogen plant in Florida. As Ben mentioned earlier, we've also partnered with TVA on a DOE application for small modular reactor. And we recently completed a project, a grid improvement in the village of Bald Head Island in North Carolina. And that's really to strengthen our system against these upcoming storms and extreme weather. But it's not just about physical assets. I'll share some statistics. During Hurricane Helene that I opened with, self-healing technology helped avoid about 185,000 customer outages across the Carolinas, which saved more than 1.2 million hours of total outage time. In 2024, the smart healing technology prevented over 2.3 million outages across our 6-state service territory, which resulted in over $11 million of total outage time. And you think of that when, again, our customers really need it the most. So around 60% of our customers are now served by self-healing and automated restoration technologies, which is a 70% increase over the last 2 years. And we have a goal of serving 80% or more in the next few years. So although we cannot avoid our customers being out all the time, we continue to work on solutions to provide our customers, again, that service when it's needed the most. But I wanted to share and leave with that ultimately, I think we've talked about this a lot. We're not just working to strengthen, we're working to strengthen the communities, not just the grid. And storm preparation for us is a real team effort. So Duke works closely with our state and local emergency management agencies, nonprofits, local organizations to coordinate responses and shared resources. Our Duke Energy Foundation just last year, actually just this year, it's $1.5 million in grants in 2025 for emergency operations centers, shelters, equip first responders with training, and really life-saving equipment, thinking of drones and the technology that's been able to provide for monitoring, for maintenance going forward. So we've been working to maintain reliability and resiliency for our customers, but we also know that this takes changes across the industry. So we really do applaud these efforts to bring our fellow presenters, the connection across our states. Again, a big thanks to Alex and Amanda from Kentucky, the experts from ICF, Guidehouse, Jupiter Intelligence, the EPRI's Climate Resilience Report, and just this work from this forum. So personally, I've already learned so much, and I'm looking forward to learning more from many of you on the line. So I know there may be questions that come up in the chat, but Miles, I believe I turned it over to Elder now.
Yes, thanks so much, Cynthia. Elder, I will pull up your presentation. And if you'd like to get started, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Miles. And I'll start with, if you can go to the next slide. All right, thank you. Again, my name is Elder Romero. I'm the Senior Manager for Advanced Planning for Avangrid. Avangrid, just to give you a small introduction about the company, it's a member of the Iberdrola Group, and it has two main lines of business. So Avangrid Networks, which has 8 regulated utilities, electric and gas, and we are located. The utilities are located in the Northeast, serving 3.3 million customers. So these utilities are in Connecticut, which is where I am right now, the United Illuminating Company, and there are some gas companies here as well. In New York, we have New York State Electric and Gas, NYSEG, Rochester Gas and Electric, RG&E, and in Maine, we have Central Maine Power. And on the other side, we have we also have a gas company in Massachusetts, but we don't have electric there. Avangrid Power, which is the other line of business, is our renewable business. So we own and operate more than 75 generating facilities across the US, which produce over 10.5 gigawatts of power. Next slide. So I know we've talked about definitions of resiliency a couple of times already during this call. The traditional definition of the system's ability to withstand, reduce, or mitigate the magnitude of duration of interruptions, especially during storms, right? During major events. But it's really more than that. Also the need to adapt to changing technology and also the needs, meeting the needs of and expectations of our customers and prosumers. So I just wanted to put that out there as well. So next slide. And just to show some history here as well. I know Nelson was talking about some of the major storms that Con Ed has been through. So this is some of the impact that we've seen. This is from our electric utility here in Connecticut, UI, in the last 15 years. These are 4 major storms or events. So you can see from the pictures here, flooding was a major issue for us during Irene and Sandy. So we actually had to preemptively de-energize some of our substations because the flooding got so high. And you can see from Irene and Sandy also that we lost more than 50% of our customer base and close to 50% during Isaias as well. Next slide. So you've probably seen this graphic before, and I know, Miles, you were making reference to this earlier in the presentation. The different phases here, withstand, absorb, recover, and advance. So especially after those 2 storms, Irene and Sandy, the company began to develop some resiliency measures to better withstand and recover from this type of storms. So, I mean, the main idea here is to bring the system back, quicker and be able to withstand those type of events and bring the system back to steady state or normal operating condition once those events do happen. Okay, next slide. So just to give you some more specific examples of the resiliency programs and projects that we have done in the past and we continue to implement for all operating companies here in the Northeast, New York, Connecticut, and Maine. So some of these, I know Nelson talked a little bit about this, so targeted resiliency or hardening projects, especially for those worst performing circuits. EVM or enhanced vegetation management. So you can see that the top figures here on the right. Before, we used to have kind of like a window, right, on the right of way that we used to trim to. That was the specification. And now we're trying to do ground to sky. So you see here, there's an 8-foot window on either side of the pole line. So this is for Connecticut and Maine, we're using 8-foot window. And in New York, we're using a 10-foot window on either side. Step down banks, trying to remove those because to try to increase operational flexibility. By eliminating those, you eliminate those islands, especially if you don't have a way to back them up during outages. Also undergrounding substation getaways. If you have, we have a lot of circuits leaving a substation. If they live on the same pole line, you have a single point of failure. So if that pole line goes down, you lose a lot of customers at the same time, which makes also restoration very difficult and challenging. So undergrounding some of those overhead circuits, leaving the substation, and also doing some selective undergrounding in some areas that are troublesome. For example, if there's a busy intersection that getting hit by vehicle accidents, may want to consider undergrounding that. Feeder ties, especially at the perimeter of our territory. So increasing the backup capabilities for our system that can reduce the outage duration. And substation flood mitigation, I talked a little bit about that already. So that can include installing perimeter walls around the coastal substations, raising the equipment, or completely relocating the substation to a different location that is not doesn't have a high risk of flooding. Automation, also installing smart switches to better segment those circuits and also reduce the duration. Next slide. So the company also developed a resiliency guide a few years back. So this guide is for construction and design standards. So installing tree wire or spacer cable for new overhead primary lines. Setting a minimum for pole class requirements for new construction, and also using strategic use of non-wood poles. So using light duty steel poles, using fiberglass cross arms, improving the guying on the pole line, improving protection of service transformers so that when you have a transformer that fails, it's isolated to that just service transformer so it doesn't take out the entire street. And installation of animal guards on all the equipment. Right now, squirrels are very active and they tend to run along the power lines, and they do cause a lot of outage, especially this time of the year. So animal guards are a very good mitigation for that type of outage. All right, next slide. So in August of 2022, PURA, which is the regulator here in Connecticut, issued a final decision in this docket, which is 17-1203, reopener 08. This is the resiliency and reliability standards and programs docket. So the main objectives of this docket was to evaluate the effectiveness of reliability and resiliency programs from the electric distribution companies here in Connecticut. Also establishing targets and metrics to improve the effectiveness of those programs, and reviewing the emergency response plans of both companies. So the docket also established a comprehensive framework, which included like risk assessment methodologies to try to identify vulnerabilities within the electric system and help prioritize the investments based on the likelihood and the impact of potential disruptions. And then something that they also included in the final decision was acknowledging the importance of climate change and the impact that that has on energy infrastructure, and encouraging the utilities to take into account climate change when making projections in planning or investment decisions. So next slide. So climate change vulnerability and resiliency studies I know Nelson went over this already, but for New York, we have these were developed back in 2023, September, and in November of 2023 for the climate change resiliency plan in November and the climate change vulnerability study in September of 2023. But we did update those plans recently in March of this year, and they're not scheduled to be updated again until 2028. In Connecticut, we did do a climate change vulnerability study as well. That was completed back in October of 2023. And for that one, the implementation is to be handled through rate cases, the proceedings in those rate cases, but there is no recurring filing requirement as of now. And then in Maine, this was completed earlier this year, and the resiliency plan is right now in process. And there is a requirement there to refile the climate change protection plan every 3 years. And I believe that is my last slide, correct?
Great. Thanks to the three of you again. Again, if anyone in the audience has any questions for these folks, if you could enter them in the Q&A box. I do have a couple questions here. So let me get started with just one for each of you, if you'd each like to address it. What's one emerging technology or approach you're excited about for severe storm mitigation? Maybe one that you see on the horizon coming forward.
I can start. I'm always curious about what AI can help us enable in terms of climate resilience and the ability to take some of the data. You think of the drone work that's ongoing. That's some really, really interesting technologies. So.
Yeah, no, that's a really good one, Cynthia. I think we're trying to figure out how do we use some of the downscaling the data related to that. I know a lot of people talk about data. Maybe on the hardware end, we talked about these interrupter switches and how do we sectionalize it a little bit more. So it's really more working within your system to think about the partial circuit isolation rather than the full feeder outage resulting from a fault. So to the extent that those get better, those allow us to bifurcate more, those need to think through, it's important to kind of think through what are the technologies that work, and as they get better, and as an underground supervisor, they've gotten a lot better. How do we do also data, but then also the hardware related to it?
Yeah, I also agree with Cynthia. I think drones are an interesting technology to be able to assess damage, especially when something big, a big event happens, to try to get accurate restoration time for customers. That could be a big help. And also, yeah, like she said, AI trying to determine the impacts before a storm happens of how many resources will we need to be able to tackle a big event.
Great, thanks very much. Another question. So based on your experience, do you have any thoughts or advice for other utilities looking to integrate resilience planning with existing distribution system planning processes?
I think we talk about our resilience journey all the time, but it's no matter you're a big utility, small utility, or rural, urban, whatever it is. I think it's important to just start. No matter where you are in your journey. In the beginning, if you saw us with a timeline, it took us a long time in the beginning. We work with a lot of stakeholders. The other thing is it's more make it tangible. I would say, when we talk to about, 50 of our engineering subject matter experts, we didn't say, hey, plan for the future or plan for climate change. It was more, what are your bread and butter specifications? What are the things that you're looking at? What do you need to design for in terms of heat, in terms of, extreme rain? all these other things, and what information do you need? So it's kind of making sure it's relatable, but then also actionable. So it's really, with our creating our group, it's the data and climate data translators for the company to be able to do that.
I would just second what Nelson is saying, and he's been such a great partner. So reaching out to others who have done the journey as well. They were very intentional. We were very intentional as well of making the work public. And that's because we know as an industry, we have to evolve together. So similar to Nelson, I would just also look to the precedents that's been set, the opportunities that are already out there and get started. So great perspective from Nelson.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's been said already here, and stakeholder engagement, working with regulators, make sure that we're working with all and we're on the same page. And also, it was mentioned before, making sure that it's affordable but also equitable, right? So any resiliency measures that we develop are making sure to keep those in mind.
Great. So question in the Q&A, it says, I haven't heard much mention of RTOs, ISOs, or FERC-approved regional planning entities. Can you discuss whether or how coordination or collaboration with a grid operator or planner is handled? Would anyone like to take that one? Nelson?
I could jump in. Yeah, I think initially when we did our 2019 study, we talked to our New York ISO in terms of how are you thinking about climate? This is how we're thinking. These are the assumptions we're making on our planning variable, temperature variable, to kind of make sure that we, as a, we're not just planning for New York City, it's all New York State to think about everything. So I said, resilience is a shared opportunity and a responsibility. The other thing is, in terms of as we're learning things in 2019 and on, we were sharing them with our ISO. The other things are, as part of EPRI's Climate Ready Initiative, I think PJM, ISO New England, Canadian ISOs equivalents, and ISO, they were part of that to be able to kind of learn what other industry people were doing, how they were thinking about things as well. And then also looking at some recent FERC orders on making sure on extreme weather. So I think it's more, like Cynthia said, making sure there's engagement, coordination, sharing, but then also, what are the problems like, or concerns or things that you're learning from one place, ISO New England and also PGM and others. And then how are we kind of tackling that together? So it's making sure that there's a lot of efforts going on, but we have to make sure that we all talk about them and share the insights accordingly. Thanks for the question.
Great. Anyone else, or I can move to the next question? Oh, great. Okay. Final question here. What are the impacts and how large are they, if you can say anything about that? So what impact do the efforts and plans to improve resilience have on the retail rates of gas and electricity? Does anyone have thoughts on impacts, or if you've looked at what those might be within your particular utility?
Yeah, I think for us in New York, as part of the law, we have to think about the 5-year impacts. I think based on our original $900 million plan, I think it was less than, 1.8% year over year for pure resilience items. But I do think, going back to Brian and the Massachusetts DPU, I think affordability is really important in thinking through. We have to do resilience. We have to think about investments in clean, but at the same time, we have to make sure that there are bill impacts recognized, but then also to the extent that others have energy affordability programs related to it. I think that there also has to be a tie. So the New York law has a review on what your investments may affect the bill. So that's in there.
Great. Elder, did you want to say something on this too?
No, I mean, that's a very hard question to answer. I mean, it really depends on the type of programs that you're proposing, but the key here is to show the benefits versus the cost, right? What's the BCA of those investments? Weigh that versus the risk of those impacts. So yeah, it really depends.
Sounds good. Oh, Cynthia, go ahead. I saw you come off.
No, I was just going to note, we don't have specific resiliency plans. We have, for instance, a multi-year rate plan in the Carolinas. So we thoughtfully approach reliability resilience projects and have the cost benefit analysis that both Nelson and Elder were mentioning. But it's always a good question on if there should be some sort of resilient, metric, and that would need to be determined through industry efforts as well. So.
Great. And we did just have a question come in through the chat too, and we have a couple minutes, so I'll post it for you all. So this one's a two-parter. So one, for utilities who have performed vulnerability assessments, could you please explain the extent of this effort, including utility resources, time it takes, et cetera? And then for utilities with overhead and underground programs, can you share how long you have had these programs, what locations you've found provide the most benefit, and other key lessons learned?
Did you want to go first, Nelson? If not, I can take the effort question too.
Yeah, you could go first, and then
Okay.
I'll jump in.
So for us, I mentioned we initiated the Carolinas T&D program in 2021 and finalized that in September 2023. So it's a several year assessment, in particular to develop your flexibility and the vulnerability assessment. We did leverage third parties, which were really valuable. And in our Carolina study, we had a very extensive stakeholder process too. So we leveraged ICF Guidehouse and Jupiter Intelligence. It involved a number of SNEs across our organization. I think that part is very, very important to do as well. I think Nelson and Elder both mentioned the importance of bringing this journey throughout the organization. So it is a bit of a time and effort. And I don't know if Elder or Nelson has more to add on that. But again, for us, I think it was a huge benefit to have Nelson, having completed that study beforehand, really helped us, really set us to, this is a methodology and a framework we can leverage and update. And then when we added the generation perspective, that was a bit of an addition. And, we leverage a lot of the insights we get from our integrated resource planning as well. So.
Yeah, maybe to add to the first question, in the first time we did it was 2017, 18, 19, so about 3 years, because we wanted to take our time, learn it. We've never done it before. This recent iteration, I think it was about 1.5 to 2 years. And then for us, we'll have to think about how we look to update our resilience plans every 5 years, so we can plan it out, space it out, and look at different things. But I would say it's more thinking about, if you're already doing something, looking at scenarios, looking at other pieces, it's really making sure that you find the right data that works for you. How do you get engineering buy-in to review the assessments, and then kind of make sure that, whether it's a rate case, whether it's something else, whether it's grants, to think through how do you tie it in moving forward. So it's really your own timeline to step up. You should start. And then it's really, how do you kind of integrate it into processes? And the first ones are always longer, but once you build a good foundation, I think it's really important.
Fantastic. Well, we are at time, so let me just say that I found this super informative and very interesting and engaging. And thanks so much to the three of you for agreeing to present. And thanks also to our previous panelists on our states panel. And to everyone who is on today and who was engaging and found this very valuable. Just so you know, we will be posting the slides that you saw today on our publications page for this webinar, as well as a recording of the webinar once it is complete. So again, thanks to everyone, and we'll hope to see you at our next one. Take care.
Thank you.